Other people die surrounded by family. I died in a parking lot alone, holding a phone I never dialed. The office New Year's party wound down around 11. I stayed until the end, of course. I always stayed until the end. There were client relationships to maintain, a junior rep who needed reassurance about next quarter, a section chief whose ego needed the right amount of flattery poured into it before he went home to his own family. I did all of that beautifully. I was very good at my job. That was the one thing no one could ever take from me, that Koji Tanaka, 52 years old, sales director of the Eastern Division, was very, very good at his job. By the time I stepped outside, the building had mostly emptied. Snow was coming down in that fat, lazy way it does when the temperature sits right at zero. The parking lot lights buzzed overhead. My breath fogged. My car sat alone in the far corner where I always parked it, away from the doors, so no one would scratch the paint. I stood there for a moment in the cold. I don't know what made me reach for the phone. Maybe the snow. Maybe the party. All those coworkers with photos of their kids on their phone screens. The section chief showing everyone his grandson. Maybe it was just that it was New Year's Eve and I was 52, and standing alone in a parking lot, and there was nowhere I needed to be. No one waiting up. No light on in any window for me. I pulled out my phone with cold fingers and scrolled to a number I hadn't called in 6 years. Kenta, my son. He'd been 8 when I stopped being a father in anything but name. I remembered vaguely. The way you remember a movie you half-watched, a small hand tugging my sleeve, asking me to come to a sports day, a recital, a birthday. I remembered saying next time Papa has work. I remembered the exact tone I used. Patient and warm and completely empty. The same tone I used on difficult clients. I had loved my son the way I closed a deal, from a distance on my schedule. He was 26 now, married. I'd heard through my ex-wife's lawyer. I hadn't been invited to the wedding. My thumb hovered over the call button. Happy New Year, I would say. Just that. Just those 2 words. And maybe he would hang up. And maybe he wouldn't. And either way, at least I would have tried once. One time in a life where I never once tried. The snow fell. I pressed nothing. Something happened behind my right eye, a bright, silent detonation, like a flashbulb going off inside my skull. The parking lot tilted. The phone slipped out of my hand and I heard it hit the asphalt very far away. My right leg folded like wet paper. I went down. The cold pressed against my cheek. I could see the phone screen a few centimeters from my face, still lit, still open to his name. Snow already starting to gather on the glass. My arm wouldn't move. My mouth wouldn't move. I lay in the snow of an empty parking lot on New Year's Eve, staring at my son's name, and I could not reach it. I'm sorry, I thought. It was the clearest thought I had ever had. I spent it all on nothing. I sold everything for a title and a corner office, and I forgot to be your father. I'm so sorry. Kenta, if I had one more. The screen dimmed, then went black. Then everything did. There is no white light. I want to say that, because I always assumed there would be, and there wasn't. There was dark, and there was warmth, and there was a sound. The sound came first. A slow, enormous, muffled thudding, deep and steady, everywhere at once, the way you'd hear a drum if you were the drum. It filled everything. It was the most important sound in the world, and I couldn't have told you why. I floated in it. I had no body, or rather I had a body but I couldn't find its edges. I was very small, and the dark was very large and warm, and I was not afraid, which frightens me now to remember, because I should have been. Time did something wrong. It stretched and folded. Sometimes the thudding sped up. Sometimes I heard other sounds through the warm dark, huge and blurred, a voice low and rumbling and another higher, and once, unmistakably, laughter. I didn't understand the words, but I understood in the animal part of whatever I now was, that the sounds were good, that they meant safe, somewhere in that long, warm dark. I understood what was happening. Not all at once. It came in pieces like light through water, and I kept pushing it away because it was impossible, and it kept coming back because it was true. I'm not dead. I'm smaller. I'm getting smaller. No, I'm getting bigger. I started as almost nothing, and I'm growing. This is a heartbeat. This heartbeat isn't mine. I'm inside it. Koji Tanaka, 52, sales director, had one final rational thought before rationality drowned in something older. This is a womb. I am being born. And then the warm dark clenched. It clenched again and again in a slow tide with a will of its own, and I was moving. Being moved, pushed by forces I had no say in through a space that was suddenly far too small. The gentle thudding was gone. Everything was pressure and sound and a rushing, roaring urgency. The whole soft universe contracting around me and squeezing me down and out. I remember panic, pure, wordless, physical panic that had nothing to do with my adult mind. My body did the panicking all by itself. My body had never done anything before, and it was doing this. Cold hit me, cold, and blinding brightness and air, real air, rushing into a space inside me that had never held air. And it hurt. It hurt so much. A raw, scalding pain in a chest the size of a teacup, and my body's answer to the pain was the only answer it knew. I screamed. I heard it. That thin, furious, reedy wail, it came out of me and I couldn't stop it, and I didn't want to. It was the truest thing I had ever done. It said, I'm here. I'm alive. I don't understand anything and I'm terrified and I'm here. Somewhere, a man's voice shouted something joyful. A woman was sobbing and laughing at the same time. Big warm hands, rough as bark, held me. Held all of me because all of me fit in 2 hands now, and something soft wiped my face and my eyes managed, for the first time, to open. The world was a smear, firelight, orange and and gold and moving shadow, a dim ceiling of dark wood beams, smoke drifting along them, the smell of wood smoke and blood and something herbal and green. My eyes couldn't focus past 30 centimeters. I understood dimly, the lens of them still soft and new, but close, very close. A face swam into the blur. A woman's face, young, exhausted, drenched in sweat, her dark hair plastered to her forehead, and she was looking down at me with an expression I had seen exactly once in my whole first life on my own mother's face. In an old photograph, holding me, and never, not once on any face turned toward me since. She was looking at me like I was the answer to a question she had asked her whole life. Her mouth moved. The sounds were strange. The shape of the language, nothing like the one I died speaking. Older and rounder in the vowels. But grief and wonder need no translation. And I understood her the way you understand rain. My son, look at him. Oh, look at him. She pulled me against her chest, against the warmth and the fast frightened drum of her heart, and I felt her tears drop onto my scalp, warmer even than her skin. My son, I could not move, I could not speak. My hands were two small useless things that curled and uncurled without my permission. My eyes leaked, and I couldn't stop that either. I was a newborn in a poor, dark, smoke-filled house in a world I did not know, in a body 1,000th the size of the one I'd worn for 52 years, and I had never in either life felt anything remotely like what I felt in that woman's arms. I was wanted. I don't think I had understood, until that exact moment, that I hadn't been. That the corner office and the title and the closed deals had been a wall I built, brick by brick, so I would never have to notice the empty rooms behind it. I had spent an entire life proving I was useful, so no one would ask whether I was loved, because I was afraid of the answer. And here was this exhausted stranger, this young woman in a language I didn't speak, holding a screaming red creature that couldn't do anything for her, couldn't earn a single thing, couldn't close a single deal, and loving it so hard she shook. The man's voice came closer, a shadow leaned in over us both. A broad face, a black beard shot with gray, hard-weathered features that were trying very hard to look stern and failing completely because his eyes were wet and his mouth kept trembling out of its frown. He reached down with one thick, calloused finger, and carefully, so carefully as if I were made of river ice, he touched my cheek. I felt it. Rough skin, warm. My whole new body turned toward it without asking me. He's strong, the man said, his rough voice cracking down the middle. Listen to him. Strong lungs. He'll live through the winter. This one. He'll live. He'll live, the woman whispered. He'll live. They said it like a prayer, like it wasn't a given. And even through the roar of my own terror and wonder, the old part of me, the cold calculating part that had read 100,000 rooms and never once misread one, took that in and filed it away. They're afraid I'll die, which means children die here often, which means this is a hard place, a poor place, a place close to the edge. I would learn, in the weeks and months to come, exactly how close to the edge. I would learn the word for famine before I could walk, but that came later. That night I knew only firelight and two faces and the smell of smoke, and the impossible, undeserved, overwhelming fact of being held. The man my father, I understood. This rough weeping mountain of a man was my father, now pressed his forehead very gently against the woman's, and the two of them bent together over the tiny howling thing that used to be Koji Tanaka, and stayed like that a long time while the fire crackled. I stopped screaming eventually. I ran out of scream. I lay in the crook of a warm arm, blinking up at the smoke on the beams, and I let the tears come, and no one there knew they weren't a newborn's tears at all. I made myself a promise that night, in the dark, in the warm, in a body that could not keep a single promise on its own. I had been given something no one is given. I knew even then that I would probably never understand how or why. A second turn. A blank page after a life I'd filled with all the wrong ink. In my first life I had a wife who left, a son who stopped calling, a phone full of clients and empty of anyone who would sit in a snowy parking lot and wait for me. In my first life I loved through usefulness. I gave things, fixed things, closed things, and called it love, and it was never love, and everyone knew it but me. I died reaching for a number I was too much of a coward to dial for 20 years. Not again. Whatever this world was, and I had already gathered, it was old and hard and hungry, a place of firelight and wood smoke and children who died young. I had 52 years of a mind inside a baby's skull. I had knowledge these people couldn't dream of, and I could feel already how badly this place needed it, how thin the line was between this warm night and a cold one where the harvest failed. I could lift them. I could make this house safe, this family fed, this whole starving valley rich. I could build. God, the things I could build. But that wasn't the promise. The promise was smaller than that and much harder. And I made it staring up at the face of a father who had wept over me before I'd earned a single thing. This time I swore to the smoke and the firelight and the strangers who loved me, I will not become a stranger to my own family. This time I will not build a wall of useful things and hide behind it. This time when they reach for me, I will be there. When I reach for them, I will not be too proud or too busy or too afraid. I will not wait until I'm dying in the snow to say the two words I owe. I will be present. Whatever else I do, I will be. For once in 2 lives, a son. My mother's heartbeat slowed under my ear, steadying now, and my father's rough hand rested warm and enormous on my back, and the fire settled into embers, and Koji Tanaka, who had died alone and would not, this time be alone finally, at last slept. Here's the thing. No one tells you about being reborn with your mind intact. It is unbearably, maddeningly boring. I had imagined in the half second I'd had to imagine anything that a second life with a 52-year-old's mind would be a cheat code. code, that I'd simply be clever, and the cleverness would flow out of me and reshape the world. What no one warns you about is that between the mind and the world sits a body, and my body was a 3-kilogram sack of reflexes that screamed when it was wet, screamed when it was hungry, screamed when it was tired, and most humiliating of all screamed, and I did not always know why, and had to lie there and let strangers guess. I could not hold my own head up. This is a fact I had never once considered about infancy. For the first weeks my head was a boulder balanced on a stalk of grass, and if no one supported it, it lolled. I would decide, with all the force of an adult will, to turn and look at the fire, and my head would simply not obey, and I'd be left staring at the wall, furious, screaming with a frustration that came out sounding exactly like a baby's colic. So I learned patience. Real patience. Not the performance of it I'd used on clients. I made the boredom into work. If I could not move, I could watch, and I could count, and I could catalog. I lay in my mother's arms, and in the woven basket they'd padded with straw and old cloth, and I studied the world 130-centimeter blur at a time. And slowly, week by week, as my eyes sharpened and my neck strengthened, the map of my new life filled in. I learned my mother's name before I learned mine. Say, my father, the weeping mountain, was Goro. He was the headman, the Nanushi, the man the 20-odd households of the village looked to when something needed deciding. That mattered. That was a lever, and I filed it away, and then hated myself a little for filing it away, because Koji had never once looked at a person he loved without also measuring their usefulness, and I had promised. So I made a rule for the new life, lying there in the straw. Notice the lever, but love the person first. Goro was gruff in a way that fooled no one in his own house. In front of the village, he was all frown and folded arms. Alone with me and Sai, he was a different animal. He'd hold me up over his head and make a low rumbling sound in his chest that I eventually understood was singing, badly, and he'd watch my face for a reaction like a man watching a fire he wasn't sure would catch. When I gurgled, he'd grin like he'd won something. When I cried, he'd panic and thrust me at Sai, like I was a hot coal. Sai saw more than Goro. I understood that fast, and it made her the most dangerous person in my small world, and also the one I loved most. She had sharp, warm eyes that went still and thoughtful when something didn't add up. And things about me kept not adding up. I gave myself away in small ways I couldn't help. I tracked conversations with my eyes, following the speaker, then turning to the answer, the way an adult does in a meeting and a 2-month-old absolutely does not. I stopped crying the instant a problem was solved, the moment the wet cloth came off, the moment the milk came with a suddenness that unsettled her, because babies cry down slowly, on inertia, and I shut off like a valve. Once, when Goro was counting bundles of something aloud by the fire, 1, 2, 3, 4, I turned my head to follow each number, and when he stopped at 4 and there were clearly 5 bundles, I fussed until he noticed and laughed and said he'd miscounted. There were 5. Sei did not laugh. Sei looked at me for a long, long moment across the firelight, and I made my face as soft and blank and stupid as I could, and drooled a little for good measure, and she looked away, but I saw her file it. Notice the liver. My own mother had one now, and it was me. I resolved that night to be more careful. I broke the resolution constantly. It is very hard to be stupid on purpose for 18 hours a day. The village, as it swam into focus over those first months, was called Ishibi Stone Place, for a gray outcrop above the creek. It sat in a valley folded between low forested hills, a day's hard walk from anywhere that mattered, which I gathered from the way people said the names of other places, with the particular tone you use for things you'll never see. Perhaps 25 households, perhaps 130 souls, though I couldn't count them yet. Rice paddies in the valley bottom, terraced up the gentler slope, a creek, a forest, a shrine, and fear. The village ran on fear the way my old company ran on quarterly targets. It was the invisible thing underneath every decision. They feared the harvest. I pieced this together from overheard talk, from the pinched look that came over faces when the weather turned wrong, from the way Sai rationed even now, in what was apparently a good year. One bad harvest I understood, and Ishibi starved. Not went hungry, starved. There were old people in the village, and there were babies in the village, and there was a conspicuous, terrible absence of anyone in between the ages of 2 and 6, and once I understood what that gap meant, I understood everything about the tone in Goro's voice when he'd said he'll live through the winter. This one. They feared the crown too in a vaguer, larger way. There was a king somewhere and lords under him, and the lords sent men for taxes, grain mostly, and labor, and the men were spoken of the way you speak of weather you can't stop, and they feared what they didn't understand. Which brings me to the day the seer came. I was 1 year old. I could sit up now and crawl in a lurching, four-limbed panic that was, I'm told, adorable, and I had perhaps 6 words I could produce on demand, all of them chosen to be maximally babyish and unthreatening ba ma, nah, while my mind ran silent and full underneath. The first you're right was a small thing. The village had a shrine at the forest edge, a weathered wooden box on stilts hung with rope and folded paper, and the person who kept it was Ute. I had heard her name spoken with the crown tone, the weather tone, the tone for forces you cannot argue with. When she came into our house that morning, I understood why. She wore a mask pale wood, a woman's calm face carved into it, so still and so smooth that the living eyes behind the eye slits seemed to belong to something wearing a person. She moved without hurry. The room, which had been full of the low, warm noise of family, went quiet around her the way a pond goes quiet when a heron lands. She was there to name me, or to confirm the name, and to look at me. That was the part everyone was tense about. I realized the looking. Sei held me up. I did my very best impression of a stupid, happy, ordinary baby, I gurgled. I reached for the shiny paper hanging from Yute's staff. I thought, giving the performance of my two lives. Yute went very still. She leaned in close. Behind the calm carved mask, her real eyes found mine and held them. And I swear, I felt the exact sensation I used to feel across a negotiating table when the other side's lead counsel was much, much smarter than I'd been told, and knew it, and was letting me talk. The sensation of being read, and I understood too late what she was reading. The same small things Sai had read. My eyes tracking a conversation. My two quick reactions. The settled, watchful old look that a 1-year-old has no business wearing. I panicked and did the only thing my body knew. I babbled and drooled and grabbed her mask. She let me. My tiny hand closed on the smooth wood and she did not pull back. And for one heartbeat, we were locked there. The baby in the mask, and then she gently disengaged my fingers and straightened and turned to Goro, and spoke in a low-level carrying voice that stopped every heart in the room. This one carries a special fate. I felt Sai's arms tighten around me. I felt, across the room, Goro go rigid. Fate, in a poor valley. One bad harvest from starving is not a gift. I understood that instantly from the way the word landed. Special is worse. Special children are watched. Special children are blamed when the rain fails and the fever comes. I had, in trying so hard to look ordinary, apparently radiated whatever it was this masked woman could see. And now the most feared person in my world had said the most dangerous possible word over my head. And I could not defend myself because I was 1-year-old. Goro's voice came out rough and low and frightened, trying to sound like an order and failing. What kind of fate? Ute was quiet a moment. The eyes behind the mask were on me again. Time will tell, she said. Guard him. And she named me, the name that was already mine, and I have carried it ever since. Haru Spring. She left the way she'd come without hurry, and the warm noise did not come back into the house for a long time. I lay in Sai's arms and looked up at Goro's frightened, frowning face, and I understood, with the cold, clear part of me that never stopped working, that I had just made my first serious mistake, and that mistakes here were not corrected with an apology memo. They followed you. They put you at the shrine when the fever came. Smaller, I told myself. You have to be smaller than this. Hide. Be nothing. Be the headman's ordinary, happy little boy, and make yourself so gently, so invisibly useful that when the day comes to be seen, they've already forgotten to be afraid. I lasted about 2 weeks. It was the stones that undid me. Sei kept a basket of smooth creek stones by the hearth, worn round and flat, of various sizes, used for pressing pickles and holding down cloth. I had been given the small ones to play with, the way you give a baby anything smooth and unswallowable to occupy its hands. And I was playing with them, or pretending to, letting my mind wander over the 50 problems of this village while my hands did baby things. And my hands, without asking me, started building. I only noticed when Sai went silent. I had stacked the stones, not in a baby's random pile that topples. I had absently sorted them largest to smallest and set them one atop another into a leaning tower, each stone chosen for a base wide enough to hold the next, the whole thing corrected for balance, 6 stones high on the packed earth floor of a farmhouse, 1,000 years before anyone in this world would think to call it engineering. My hand was reaching for a 7th. I looked up. Sai was staring at the tower, then at my hands, then at my face. She had gone completely still, the way she went still when a thing didn't add up. Except this time there was no way to make it add up, because babies do not do this. Babies knock the tower down. That is the entire point of babies and towers. And I had built a load-bearing column out of graded stones with the deliberation of a man who had spent 40 years watching structures and knowing why they stand. For one long, terrible second, mother and son looked at each other across the little leaning tower of stones. Then I did the only thing left to do. I hit it. I swung my fat little arm and knocked the whole thing sprawling across the floor. And I laughed a big, wet, delighted, idiot baby laugh, the laugh of a creature who loves nothing more than knocking things over, and I clapped my hands at the wonderful chaos I'd made. Saya did not laugh with me. She reached out slowly and gathered me into her lap and held me a little too tightly and rested her chin on the top of my head, and I could feel her heart going quick and hard. She didn't say special. She didn't say fate. She was too smart to say those words even to herself. But her arms said them. Her arms said, I know there's something in you, and I don't know what, and I am terrified, and I love you, and I will not let anyone at that shrine hear one word of this from me. I understood then that I had, without meaning to, gained my first ally and my first jailer in the same person, and that they were the same person because that is what a mother is. Be smaller, I told myself again, uselessly, my cheek against my mother's fast-beating heart. Be smaller. There were others I noticed. In those first 2 years while I practiced being small and mostly failed. There was Yuna, a girl my own age, loud before she could walk, who barreled into every room like a thrown stone. She fell down constantly and got up angry, never crying, and once, when an older boy took her stick, she took it back and hit him with it, and I thought, watching from Saya's hip, that one has no fear in her at all. That one, when the day comes, will do the thing everyone else is too afraid to do. I filed her away, and then remembering my rule, I made myself also just like her, because she was funny. There was Kohana quiet where Yuna was loud, a small careful girl who watched the world from the shelter of her mother's leg and drew shapes in the dirt with a finger, patient shapes, better shapes than a child should draw. That one sees. Sai liked her. The two girls, loud and quiet, already circled each other with the wary interest of opposites. And there was Ai, older than us by several years. The girl who ended up minding the whole flock of little ones while the adults worked the patties steady, unflappable, dividing food fairly, and settling squabbles with a word. That one manages. Every operation needs a person who manages while the clever people are off being clever. I found her, across the smoke of 2 years of firelight, and I marked her without knowing yet what for. But that is the cold part of me talking, and I promised to lead with the warm. So this is the truest thing about those first 2 years. I was happy, bewilderingly, undeservedly happy. Every night I fell asleep between a father who sang badly and a mother who saw too much. And every morning I woke to a valley I already loved, poor and frightened and one harvest from ruin. And I lay there in the straw with a 52-year-old's mind and a 2-year-old's body. And I felt the shape of what I was going to do begin to gather in me like weather. Start small, I told the smoke on the beams. Stay hidden. Make yourself so quietly useful they forget to be afraid. And when they can't be poor and frightened anymore, when there's enough, when the gap between 2 and 6 years old closes and no one starves, then let them see who you are. The creek ran past the village, day and night, full of fish that no one was catching in any real number. I had ideas about that creek. The creek was full of food and the village was hungry. And the reason those two facts sat side by side was one word: labor. I worked it out over the summer of my 3rd year, on the days Sai carried me down to wash cloth while the older children splashed in the shallows. Ishibi's people fished the creek. Sure, a boy with a spear, a woman with a scoop net, the occasional line. But every one of those methods needed a person standing there, spending hours to catch a handful of fish. And every pair of hands in this village was already spoken for from before dawn to after dark, bent double in the paddies or hauling water or minding the young. Nobody could afford to stand in a creek all day. So the creek stayed full and the people stayed thin. And the fish swam past 130 starving souls, uncaught, because catching them cost the one thing no one had: time. The answer was a trap, a thing that fished for you, a thing that stood in the water all night while you slept, and pulled food from the current for free. I knew exactly what to build. I had seen weir traps in a documentary in my first life, in a museum, in a dozen half-remembered places, a fence of stakes and woven willow that funneled fish down into a chamber they couldn't swim back out of. Set it in a narrowing of the creek, point the funnel downstream, come back at dawn to a basket boiling with fish. It was simple. It was ancient. It was, in principle, so obvious that I couldn't quite believe no one here had stumbled onto it, until I remembered that obvious is a word you only earn after 10,000 years of other people's mistakes. And these people were standing at the very front of that line, with none of it behind them yet. I could see the whole thing in my head, complete down to the weave of the funnel. I could not build a single stick of it. I was 3. My hands could barely hold a spoon. This is the part of my new life I found hardest, harder than the boredom, harder than the fear. I had the whole cathedral in my mind and the muscles of a toddler. Every idea I had to launder through some larger, stronger, skeptical adult and get them to build it while believing it was their own notion, or a child's game. Because a 3-year-old who says build a woven funnel, weir and point the mouth downstream is not clever. He is cursed, and there was already a masked woman in this valley who had said fate over my head. So I did the only thing my body was actually good at. I picked Uncle Taku for the job the way I'd once picked accounts to Chase, because he was the softest target with the best tools. Taku wasn't my uncle. Everyone's children called him that. He was the village's carpenter and fixer, a wide grumbling man with forearms like ham hocks, and a permanent air of being 3 jobs behind. Which he was, because he was the only person in Ishibe who could make anything more complicated than a fence. He mended plows and roofs and the shrine steps and everyone's broken everything, and he complained the entire time, and he had a soft spot for underfoot children the size of a patty. I began by simply being underfoot. I would crawl, then toddle into his workyard and sit in the wood shavings and watch him with the fixed, delighted attention of a child who thinks the grown man is the most fascinating creature alive, which, to be fair, from an engineering standpoint, he was. He was the only person around who could turn my ideas into wood. He'd grumble at me to get out from under his adze, and then he'd hand me a smooth offcut to gnaw on, and I'd file away every joint and cut, and how he split green willow. Then I started building on the creek bank, in the mud, with my useless little hands. Stakes twigs jammed in a line across a rivulet, angled inward, a little woven cup of grass at the point. I did it over and over, day after day, and every time an adult passed I made it a game, splashing, laughing, knocking it down and doing it again, the idiot baby laugh I'd perfected. To anyone watching it was a toddler, obsessed with sticking sticks in the water. Only the shape was always the same, always the fence, always the funnel, always the mouth pointed downstream. Yuna caught on first, in her way. She was 3 like me, and afraid of nothing, and she plopped down in the mud beside me one afternoon, watched me build my little stick fence, and immediately tried to build a better one, which is exactly what I wanted, because a loud, fearless girl building fish fences is a game children play, and a game children play is invisible. It took most of the summer of pretending before Taku actually looked at what I was making. He'd come down to the creek to soak green wood. He did that, weighted bundles of willow underwater to keep them supple, and he found me and Yuna in the shallows with our stick fence. And he stood there wiping his hands and squinting at it, and I watched him see it. I watched the frown change. He crouched. He looked at the way the little fence angled the flow, the way a leaf caught in the current got shunted down toward our grass cup and couldn't easily drift back out, and I said, in my thick baby mouth, pointing the only 2 words I let myself risk, fish. Taku laughed, but he didn't stop looking. He built it as a joke. I want to be honest about that, because it matters. He did not build my weir because a 3-year-old was a genius. He built it because it was a slow evening, and the headman's odd little boy had been playing at fish fences all summer, and Taku was fond of the boy, and it cost him an hour of green willow he'd already soaked. And this is the part that mattered most because he could already half see that the shape might actually work. The idea was in the world now. I'd put it there, stick by stick, over a whole summer, until it looked less like a curse and more like common sense that any fool might have thought of. He set it where the creek narrowed below the washing place, where the whole flow squeezed through a gap between 2 rocks a little wider than a man, a fence of stakes driven into the bed, angled from both banks inward, funneling everything toward a central mouth, and behind the mouth, a woven basket chamber of split willow wide inside. Its entrance a cone of inward-pointing withies, so a fish nosing through the narrow point couldn't find its way back out through the spread of them. He grumbled about the funnel cone. I'd fussed and splashed and rebuilt my grass version of it 4 times in front of him, until he'd said, exasperated, fine, fine, I'll make the little door your way, you demon, and made it my way. Inward pointing, which is the whole secret of the entire device. He finished at dusk. Goro had come down to watch, arms folded, wearing his headman face, which meant he thought his son was being humored, and was too proud to say so, and too fond to stop it. Sei stood beside him with me on her hip, and she was not wearing an amused face. She was watching me watch the trap, and I made myself look like a happy, tired little boy. And inside I was doing arithmetic. The creek ran all night. It never stopped. That was the whole point. The labor of the water was free and endless, and it would fish for us while every soul in Ishibe slept. If the funnel held, if the fish ran at night the way I remembered fish ran, then a device that cost one grumbling carpenter 1 hour of an evening he was going to waste anyway would, by dawn, don't, I told myself, don't count the fish before the water gives them to you. But God, if it works, if it worked, it changed the equation of the whole village. Not one meal, a method, a thing you build once and it feeds you every dawn forever, for free, while you sleep. That was the shape of everything I meant to do here, in miniature in Willow. Take the endless free labor of the world, water, wind, gravity, weather, and set it to work for people who had only ever had their own aching backs. We went home. I did not sleep well, and not because I was 3. I lay between my parents and listened to the creek and did the sum again and again in the dark. We went down at first light. Half the village came, drawn by rumor the way rumor draws people in a place where nothing happens. Taku, Goro, Sai with me. Yuna dragging her mother, quiet Kohana at the edge, I herding a knot of smaller children, a dozen adults with the wary curiosity of people who've been let down by hope before and are braced for it. Taku waded out to the chamber. He got his hands under it, and I saw his face change before he even lifted it clear, because he could feel the weight, and I saw Goro's headman mast crack, and then Taku hauled the basket up out of the creek, and the whole thing was alive. It thrashed. It was a solid, heaving silver mass of fish, packed in against each other, so many that the willow bulged, so many that water and fish spilled over the rim as he lifted it. More fish than a boy with a spear could take in a week, more fish than the scoop net women took in a month, taken in a single night by nobody, by the water, by a device that had sat in the dark and worked, while 130 people slept. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Yuna shrieked with delight, and everyone was shouting at once. Taku stood grinning like a fool with silver spilling out of his arms. Goro waded straight in, headman dignity forgotten, and plunged his hands into the basket, and laughed a huge, shocked, cracking laugh. The laugh of a man who is realizing that this winter, at least, the gap between 2 and 6 years old might not take another child. I felt Sai's arms go rigid around me. I made the mistake of looking up at her. I should have kept my eyes on the fish, joined the babble, been 3. But I looked up, and she was already looking down at me. Not at the miracle in the creek at me, and on my face, before I could smooth it away, was not a child's wonder. It was satisfaction, the quiet, grim satisfaction of a man watching a plan come off exactly as he calculated it, right down to the weight of the catch. She saw it. I watched her see it. Her eyes went from the boiling basket of fish that no one in this village had ever known how to catch, to the summer of stick fences her strange child had built in the mud, all the same shape, all pointing downstream, and back to my face, and she didn't say fate. She didn't say anything. She just held me tighter, and I felt her heart under my cheek going hard and quick, and I understood that my mother now knew not the how of it, not the truth, but that this had not been luck, that her son had reached into the creek with his mind and pulled out the winter. I did the math anyway, because I couldn't stop, because I never could. Enough here to eat well tonight, and still have surplus. Surplus you could preserve. If I could get them to preserve it, salt it, dry it, hang it in smoke, and preserved fish was food that kept through a bad harvest, food that could be traded, food that turned the terror word famine from a sentence into a risk you could hedge. One trap had done this. 2 traps. 10. A trap on every narrows of the world tilt. I had felt it coming, and ignored it. A fizzing at the edges of my sight, a lightness. The specific dizzy static I now knew meant I'd been holding my adult mind at full effort for too long, driving a 3-year-old brain past what a 3-year-old brain could carry. Calculating trap yields on a hillside at dawn while my body was tired and hadn't eaten was, it turned out, exactly the kind of thing that broke the fragile machine I now lived in. The riverbank slid sideways. The shouting went thin and far away, like it was coming down a long pipe. I heard distantly my own name, Haru, in Sai's voice sharpening into fear, and I tried to answer and my mouth wouldn't. And the last thing I saw was the silver fish spilling bright over the willow rim, and then the gray came up over everything and took me. I woke on the sleeping mat at home. Daylight, the smell of fish already smoking somewhere, my head thick and slow. Goro's face was over me before my eyes were fully open, and it was gray with a fear I had never seen on it, not even the night Ute said fate. He'd been crying. This enormous gruff mountain of a man had been crying over me. Again, and I understood all at once that I had done to my new family the exact thing I had died swearing never to do. I had made them love me, and then, chasing something clever, chasing usefulness, I had frightened them half to death. My son's number, unread on a snowy screen. The shape of the old mistake, wearing new clothes. Saya sat on my other side and she wasn't crying. She was worse than crying. She was calm the way you get calm when you've decided something. And she took my small hot hand in both of hers, and she said very quietly, so Goro couldn't hear, in the voice you use for a secret between two people, "You have to be careful. Whatever this is, whatever you are." Her thumb moved on the back of my hand. "You cannot fall down like that. You cannot leave us. Do you understand me, Haru? Whatever you can do, you are not allowed to die doing it." She didn't wait for an answer. A 3-year-old couldn't give. She didn't need one. She'd said the thing and she smoothed my hair back off my hot forehead, and she stayed. I lay there and learned the hardest lesson of my second life. Harder than patience, harder than being small. The mind was not the limit anymore. The mind was fine. The mind was full of cathedrals and mills and traps and 100 years of things this valley had never dreamed. The limit was the body, this small, fragile, borrowed body that could only hold so much of me at once before the light went out. Brilliance had a price here, and the price was consciousness. And if I spent past it, I didn't just fail. I broke the hearts of the 2 people I'd been given a whole second life to love. Slower. I told the smoke on the beams the way I told it everything. One thing at a time. Rest between. Let them see a boy, not an engine. Down at the creek, the water was still running, still working, still pulling the winter out of the dark for free. And in the smoke shed, the first fish of Ishibe's new life were beginning to dry. One weir made us fed. Now I needed to make us rich in a poor valley. Starts with 2 things nobody here had. Preserved food and children who could count. I was 4 now and I could really talk. A whole year of practicing my mouth in secret while pretending to babble had paid off. And I'd let my speech come in fast, but not too fast. Quick for a 4-year-old. Not impossible for one. Enough to be called clever. Not enough to be called cursed. There is a very narrow band between what a bright child and what an unnatural thing. And I lived in that band on purpose, and it was exhausting. The fish came first because the fish were already happening and I only had to steer them. By the second summer, we had 4 weirs on the creek, and the problem had inverted. We had too many fish. A weir doesn't stop pulling fish out of the dark just because you've eaten your fill. The water keeps working whether you need it to or not, and fish rot fast in summer heat. And a heap of rotting fish is not wealth. It's flies and shame. Half the early catch spoiled before anyone could eat it, and Goro started muttering about pulling weirs, and I understood that a resource you can't keep is not a resource. It's a mess, so I taught them to keep it. I had to launder this the same careful way, through play, through pestering, through letting the adults think it was their idea. The village already knew salt preserved things a little. Salt was precious though, hauled in from far off, hoarded for the table. Nobody had put it together with the fish flood, and nobody knew the trick that made a little salt go a long way. Or that smoke did most of the work salt couldn't. I got Sai to help me, because Sai was the one who'd said whatever you are and held me. And I had decided that Sai was going to be my hands in the world for the things too complicated to pantomime. I didn't tell her a secret. I just needed her, out loud, in a way I never once needed anyone in my first life. "Show me," I'd say. "And what if we put it in the smoke like the shrine paper?" And she'd look at me with those still sharp eyes and then silently do the thing and watch what happened and file it. The method was simple, and it was old, and it worked. Split the fish, salt them, let the salt pull the water out over a day, then hang them over a low, smoky fire of green wood in Taku's old drying shed until they went hard and dark and would keep for a season. The smoke did what the salt couldn't afford to. A hard smoked fish would last through winter, through a bad harvest, through the terror season, hanging harmless from a rafter until you needed it. The first shed of them came out looking like leather and smelling like heaven, and Goro held one up and turned it over and over, and I watched the same crack go through his headman face that had gone through it at the creek. Because he wasn't holding a fish. He was holding a fish in January. He was holding the thing that stood between the village and the shrine when the rice failed. This keeps, he said slowly. This keeps, like it was a spell. It keeps, I agreed. 4 years old, chewing on a dried one, and did not do the arithmetic out loud, though I did it in my head carefully, sitting down well-fed, the way Sai had taught me to be careful. 130 people, 4 weirs, smoke sheds, enough surplus kept properly that famine stopped being a death sentence and started being a hardship. And past feeding ourselves a surplus you could load on your back and carry to another village, another market, and trade for salt, for iron, for cloth, for the money that Ishibe had almost never seen. Preserved fish was Ishibe's first real thing to sell. I filed it under income and I made myself get up slowly and I did not faint. The second thing was harder to launder because it wasn't a craft. It was reading. And reading in this world belonged to monks and lords and the men who came for taxes. And a peasant child who could read was, again, in that narrow, dangerous band. But I needed it. Not for me, for them. Everything I meant to build, all of it, would eventually need people who could keep a tally, read a mark, follow an instruction I couldn't stand over their shoulder to give. A village of clever hands that couldn't read would always need me standing in the middle of it, and I did not want to be a man everyone needed and no one loved. I'd done that already. I died of it in a parking lot. This time the machine would run without me at its center, so I turned it into a game, because a game is invisible and a lesson is dangerous. I got Taku to fire me a batch of little clay tablets flat, palm-sized, cheap, telling him they were for a game, which was true, and on each one I scratched a single sound. Not the whole formal writing the monks used, all thousands of borrowed characters. I couldn't teach that and it would have taken years. I built a syllabary, one simple mark for each sound of our speech, 40-odd of them, made up plain and easy. The kind of thing that in my old world took clever people centuries to invent, and I could just remember a 4-year-old remembering the shape of an alphabet. Then I taught Yuna and Kohana to play with the tablets. They were mine to teach because they were always underfoot with me anyway. Yuna, loud and fearless and treated everything as a competition. So I made reading a competition. Match the sound to the mark. Fastest wins. First to spell your own name in mud gets to skip fetching water. Yuna could not stand to lose, so Yuna learned to read out of pure spite, hammering the sounds into her head so she could beat me and Kohana, and never once noticed she was learning anything, because she thought she was winning. Kohana learned the opposite way. She was quiet and careful and she loved the shapes, the way a good line felt to draw, and she'd sit with a tablet for an hour, tracing a single mark until it was perfect while Yuna raced ahead sloppily. Between them they had the whole of it, Yuna's speed, Kohana's care, and they started, without quite meaning to compete over me, over who sat next to me, who I taught first, which I found baffling and Sae found funny and I filed under deal with later. I, older, watched us play for a week, and then quietly asked if she could learn too, in the level voice of a girl who has already decided and is only being polite about it. I gave her a tablet. She learned faster than any of us without the game, because she just wanted it, and within a month she was teaching the smaller ones herself while I rested, and I looked at her doing that and thought, there, that's the manager. That's the one who runs it while I sleep. Word got around, the way things do in a place where nothing happens. The headman's boy had made a game that taught children their letters, real letters, sound letters, faster than the traveling monk who came twice a year and charged rice for the privilege. Children who couldn't yet plow could spell their own names in the dirt. That was strange. That was, in the careful tone people used, remarkable. Adults came to watch. Some laughed, some went quiet. And I felt, without seeing her, the attention of the shrine turned toward us again, Yute, somewhere behind her calm carved mask. Hearing that the boy she'd said fade over was now handing letters to peasant children like sweets. I didn't know yet whether she was watching to protect us or to condemn us. I only knew she was watching. I made sure the game looked exactly like a game. It couldn't last. And it broke over the reading. And it broke because of the fainting. I'd pushed too hard again. Not as badly as the riverbank, I'd learned that much. I rationed myself now, one hard thing a day and rest between. But there was too much happening, and I was 4, and I wanted all of it now. The fish and the letters and a dozen ideas past them crowding my head. And one gray afternoon, in the drying shed, standing over a batch of tablets, working out how to grade the salt so we'd waste less of it. The fizzing came up at the edges of my sight, and the world went thin, and I sat down hard against the wall before I fell. So at least I didn't crack my head. And Kohana screamed for a grown-up. I didn't fully go under this time. I came back within a minute, sweaty and shaking, propped against the shed wall with Sai's arms around me, and Goro's huge frightened face filling the doorway. And Goro, who had been so proud, who had held the smoked fish like a spell, who loved me so much it came out sideways as gruffness Goro broke the other way. Fear does that. It turns love inside out, and it comes out as a fist. No more, he said. His voice was shaking and he made it hard to cover the shaking. He crouched down in front of me and took my shoulders in his enormous hands, gentle even now, even furious. And I understood the fury was terror wearing a costume. No more of this. No more tablets. No more standing over the fish fires doing sums with your face. You're a child. You're my child. You will play like a child and eat like a child and sleep like a child. And you will stop falling down. His voice cracked clean through. I won't have it. I won't watch you. I won't. I understood exactly what he wasn't saying. The gap between 2 and 6, the children the shrine had taken. He had held me on the night I was born and said he'll live through the winter, like it wasn't a given. And now his strange gifted son kept collapsing on hillsides and in sheds, and every collapse was, to Goro, the fever, the thing that emptied the middle of the village, come for his boy at last. He forbade the headwork out of love. It was the most loving thing anyone had ever done to me, and it was a cage, and both of those were true at once. I felt the old life reflex rise in me, the cold, clever reflex to manage him, to say the words that would move him, to negotiate the child's brilliance back out of its cage the way I'd negotiated 1,000 rooms. I could have done it. I knew exactly which words. I didn't use them. I looked at my father's terrified face, and I made myself, for once, not be clever at a person I loved. I just leaned into his hands and let myself be and tired and frightened too. And I said, "I'm sorry, Papa. I scared you. I'm sorry." And he pulled me in against his chest, that mountain of a man, and held me too tight. And I felt him shaking, and over his shoulder I saw Sei watching us both with her still sharp eyes, and I understood the shape of the years ahead. This was going to happen again and again. I would push, he would cage me. The cage would be made of love, and I would resent it, and be grateful for it in the same breath. This was the price of being wanted. In my first life, no one had ever cared enough to forbid me anything. I'd have traded every closed deal for one person frightened enough of losing me to grab my shoulders and say no more. I let him hold me. I did not argue. And underneath, quiet, patient, I began to plan how to build with my mind while looking like I was resting my body, how to think slower, in pieces, across days. So the machine held, how to make AI and Sai and Taku into my hands, so I never had to stand over a fire with my face doing sums again. If I couldn't be seen working, I would work through other people. I'd been doing it all along. I'd just have to do it better. The doubter arrived at the end of that summer, and I want to remember him. Because he's the first of a long line and because he planted something I collected later. A merchant came through, a real one. A lean, sharp man with a laden pony and 2 porters. One of the traders who worked the road between the market towns and stopped at poor villages to buy cheap and complain loudly. He came to buy our fish, because word of Ishibe's smoked fish had begun, very faintly, to travel with the road. He bought it cheap, and he was pleased with himself. And while Goro haggled with the flat, exhausted patience of a man who's never had the upper hand in a trade in his life, the merchant's eye fell on us, on me, and Yuna and Kohana, cross-legged in the dirt with our clay tablets, spelling. He watched for a moment, then he laughed. Not a kind laugh. "Peasant brats playing scholar," he said to Goro. "Loud enough for us. That's a fine thing. Teach a pig to read and you've still got a pig." He shook his head, amused, tucking away his cheaply bought fish. "Letters won't fill a rice bowl, headman. Best set them to work before they get ideas. Nothing sadder than a farmer's child who thinks he's clever." He looked right at me when he said it. The way men like him always find the one child watching too closely. Especially that one. Got old eyes? That one. Bad luck. Eyes like that, he didn't mean anything by it. He was gone within the hour. Up the road with our fish for 1/10 of what he'd sell it for. Pleased with his cleverness. And he never thought of us again. I thought of him. I sat in the dirt with the tablet in my lap and I watched his pony's rump disappear up the track. And I did something Koji never did. I didn't get angry, and I didn't get hurt. I got patient. I filed him. Not his name. I never got his name. His face. His laugh. Teach a pig to read. I filed the exact shape of a man who buys cheap from people he's decided are beneath thinking, and I made him, in my head, into a marker. A thing to measure by later because I knew something the merchant didn't. I knew what a springed cart could do to a village's trade. I knew that fish carried smooth over bad roads arrived whole and sold high. I knew that a village of children who could read and count would, in a handful of years, outtrade a man who thought reading was a joke. He'd sneered at a pig learning letters. Someday, I promised the dust his pony had kicked up, someday a trader would come up that road, and it would be one of us going down it. Cart floating over the stones, ledger in a child's careful hand, and the man who bought cheap would find he had nothing left to buy. Later, I told myself, the word I told myself about everything now. I set the tablet down, because I could feel the fizz starting at the edges, and I'd promised my father, and I lay back in the warm dust between Yuna and Kohana, and looked up at the summer sky, and let myself for one whole afternoon, just before. The creek ran, the fish smoked. 2 little girls argued over which one of them was going to marry me, which I found horrifying, and the whole village drying shed smelled of the winter we would not starve through. It was, I thought, a good start. A small, hidden, patient start. The roads were terrible, though. Everything we made arrived broken, or arrived cheap because it arrived shaken half to pieces on those rutted tracks. I had ideas about the roads too, or rather about the carts. We could catch fish and smoke fish and count fish, and none of it mattered, because everything we made shook itself to pieces on the way to anyone who'd pay for it. I was 5 now and I'd spent a year learning the shape of Ishibe's real problem. And the real problem was the road. Not our road, there was no our road. Just a rutted track that wandered down the valley and joined a slightly larger rutted track that eventually, 2 days off, met something a lord's men might call a road. Everything the village had to sell had to travel that. And travel broke things. I watched it happen every time. A cart went out loaded smoked fish and willow panniers. The coarse gray pottery Ishibe's women made, jars of pickled greens hauled by an ox or by men on the shafts, wheels dropping into every rut and slamming out of it. And by the time it reached a market, half the pottery was cracked, the jars were seeping, the fish were shaken to fragments and dust in the bottom of the baskets, and broken goods sell for nothing. The merchant who'd called us pigs bought our fish cheap, partly because he knew it arrived half ruined. He was pricing in the breakage before it even left the village. The cart itself was the villain, and no one could see it. Because to them, the cart was just what a cart was. 4 solid wheels, or two pinned rigid to a solid axle, pinned rigid to a solid bed. Every jolt of every rut passing straight up through the wood into the load, with nothing in between to soften it. The cart was the road. It transmitted the road perfectly into whatever you loaded on it. That was the whole disease. I knew the cure. It was so simple it embarrassed me to hold it in my head while these people broke their pottery year after year. You put something springy between the wheels and the bed. You let the axle move up and down over the ruts while the bed stays level. You break the connection between the road and the load. Suspension. A 5,000-year-old obviousness that just hadn't happened here yet, because obvious is a thing you only earn afterward. And I knew the shape to use, because it was the simplest shape and the one Taku could actually build. A leaf spring. A stack of long curved strips of springy material, bolted together, mounted between the axle and the bed. The axle hangs from the spring flexes, the ruts go into the flex instead of into the pots. I'd seen them under every truck and cart of my old world. I could see this one complete, down to how the leaves should taper. The trouble was material. A steel leaf spring wants good spring steel, and Ishibi had a village smith who made hoe blades and mended pots and had never made a spring in his life. And steel was precious and thin here. But you don't strictly need steel. You need something long and springy that returns to shape, and Ishibi was drowning in exactly such a thing. Bamboo. Well-seasoned bamboo, split and laid in curved layered strips, lashed and pegged into a leaf, would flex and spring and return over and over for a long time before it failed. And when a leaf failed, you'd just make another, because it was bamboo. It grew up the hillside for free. It wouldn't last like steel. It didn't have to. It had to make the pots arrive whole, and it would. Getting Taku to build it was once again a campaign. And I was under a truce with my father that made campaigns hard. Goro had forbidden the headwork. He hadn't forbidden me from being a child who liked Uncle Taku's workshop, because he couldn't. Every child liked Taku's workshop, so I lived in the gap. I couldn't stand over a fire doing sums with my face I'd promised, and I'd meant it, and I'd learned the hard way what happened to my body when I pushed, but I could play in the woodyard. I could ask Taku 100 small questions across 100 small days, each one harmless, each one nudging. I could work in pieces, slow resting between, the way I'd trained myself, so the machine held and no one saw the engine run. I started by breaking a cart on purpose, more or less. I rode out on the loaded cart one morning with Taku, he let me. I was 5 and light and good company, and every time we hit a bad rut, I'd cry out and grab the pottery and cluck over it like a little old woman. Oh no! Oh, the jar! It'll break! It always breaks! Until Taku, half laughing, said yes, yes, it always breaks. That's the road. Nothing to be done. Nothing to be done. I'd planted the wound, now I made him feel it every rut of the way there and back. Then I made him feel the springiness. I gave him the bamboo without telling him what it was for. I found a good springy length of seasoned bamboo and I played with it in the yard, bent it, let it snap back, laughed, bent it again, put a stone on the end, and watched it bounce, put a heavier stone and watched it flex and hold and bounce the stone gently instead of dropping it hard, over and over. Day after day, a little boy obsessed with a bendy stick in a rock, the same way I'd been a little boy obsessed with sticks in the creek. Yuna joined in, of course, because Yuna could not watch anyone play with anything without deciding to do it better. And now there were 2 children bouncing rocks on bamboo in the woodyard, which is a game children play, which is invisible. Then I put the 2 wounds together in front of him. I dropped a clay tablet off the workbench onto the packed floor crack. It broke and I made a big sad show of it. Then I laid a bent length of bamboo across 2 blocks and dropped a second tablet onto the middle of the bamboo, and the bamboo flexed and caught it and let it down soft, and the tablet didn't break. And I gasped like it was a miracle, and looked up at Taku with enormous eyes. The stick saves it, I said. The bendy stick saves it. Uncle Taku put the bendy stick under the cart, then the jars don't break. Taku stood there a long time. I watched him build it in his own head. That was the whole art of it. I never wanted him to build my idea. I wanted him to build his idea, the one I'd loaded into him piece by piece until it went off on its own, and I saw it go off. His eyes moved from the unbroken tablet on the bamboo to the cart in the yard, and his frown changed, and he crouched and picked up the bamboo and flexed it and stared through it at something only he could see. And he said, slowly, in the voice of a man who thinks he's just had an idea, if I laid a few of these, between the axle and the bed layered so they don't snap, the wheel could jump the rut, and the bed wouldn't feel it. He looked at me, wonder cracking his grumble. The jars wouldn't feel the road at all. That's a good idea, Uncle Taku, I said, 5 years old, and meant every word, because it was now genuinely his. He built it over a month, cursing the whole way, and the cursing was how I knew he'd fallen in love with it. He split and seasoned bamboo, laid the leaves in a taper long one on the bottom, shorter ones stacked above, the way I'd nudged him toward by fussing that one bendy stick isn't enough, it needs friends, littler friends on top, and lashed and pegged them into a curved leaf. And he made the smith fashion 2 iron shackles to hang the axle from the leaf ends, and he mounted a leaf under each side of a cart bed, and the day he finished he stood back with his arms folded and his lips stuck out, pretending he wasn't holding his breath. We loaded it, full pottery jars, panniers of smoked fish, the whole ruinous cargo that always arrived half dead, and Taku took the ox out to the worst stretch of track he could find, the washboard below the shrine, with half the village trailing behind, because half the village trailed behind everything, now that everything the headman's odd boy touched turned strange and lucky. The ox pulled the cart over the ruts. The bed floated. That's the only word. The wheels dropped and slammed through every rut. Same as always, you could see them jolting. Hear the axle knock, but the leaves flexed and swallowed it, and the bed above road level gliding, the jars sitting on it, barely trembling, the fish undisturbed. Taku walked alongside with one hand on the bed, feeling it not shake, and his mouth was hanging open, and Yuna ran along whooping, and Goro walked behind with his arms folded, and his headman face on, and his eyes wet, because his son had done it again. The strange, lucky, terrifying thing, in a form so plainly useful that not even the shrine could call it a curse. A cart that didn't break the pots was not a fate, it was a blessing. Everyone could see that a cart that didn't break the pots was a blessing. I did the arithmetic quietly, sitting down, well-fed, resting. Before half our goods arrived broken and the whole load sold cheap because the buyer priced in the breakage. Now the pottery arrived whole, the jars sealed, the fish intact, and whole goods sell for 2-3 times what shaken ruins sell for. Same fish, same pots, same road, same labor. The cart had been eating our wealth this whole time, quietly, every trip, for generations, and no one had seen it because the cart was just what a cart was. I didn't faint. I'd built the whole thing in pieces across a month, slow, resting between, working through Taku's hands and Yuna's competition and a bouncing rock. I'd learned the engine had run the whole time and no one had seen it, and my body had held. The merchant came back at the end of the season, the same one. Lean, sharp, laden pony, 2 porters. Teach a pig to read. I'd filed his face and here it was again. Come up the track to buy our fish cheap. He didn't know yet. He came into the yard with his old amused contempt, ready to haggle Goro down the way he always did, ready to price in the breakage, and Goro, this is the part I loved. Goro had learned something too. This past year watching his son turn the world sideways. Goro didn't say a word about the cart. He just let the merchant look at the fish. The fish were whole, not fragments and dust in the bottom of a pannier whole. Dark, oiled, intact smoked fish, packed neat, because we'd started carting them the short hauls on the springed cart to test it, and they'd stopped breaking. And Say and I had graded and packed them properly, and they looked like goods, not like sweepings. The merchant's face did something complicated. He picked up a fish, turned it over. It didn't crumble. He picked up a jar of pickle. The seal was intact, not seeped. He looked at the goods, and then slowly, the way men like him do, he began to lower his opening price to hide how impressed he was, the reflex of a man who's decided everyone across the table from him is a pig. And Goro named a price. A high price. A whole goods price. And when the merchant scoffed, Goro shrugged his big shoulders and said, in the flat, patient voice he'd used all his life to lose trades, only this time it wasn't losing. These arrive whole. Ask anyone down the road what our fish arrive like now. If you don't want whole fish at a whole price, the next trader will. The merchant laughed the sneering laugh. And how, he said, does a mud village like this get fish down 2 days of that road without smashing it to paste? That's when Taku, who could not help himself, said the cart, and jerked his thumb at the springed cart standing in the yard. The merchant went to look at it, still smirking, expecting some peasant nonsense. He crouched by the wheel. He saw the leaves. He put his hand on the bed and pushed, and the bed dipped and sprang back, level, and the smirk fell off his face like a dropped tile. He was a merchant. He understood immediately what he was looking at, in a way the villagers couldn't. He'd spent his life watching goods arrive broken and pricing in the breakage, and here was a cart that ate the road, and he knew, kneeling in the dust, that a cart like this was worth more than a season of fish, that a man with carts like this could carry fragile goods anywhere, and undercut everyone, that this changed the price of everything that moved on a road. He looked up. He looked past Taku, straight at me, the boy with old eyes he'd told to stop thinking. He remembered. I watched him remember. I looked back at him, 5 years old, sitting in the dust, and I did not say a single word. I didn't need to. Teach a pig to read. I did not say. Nothing sadder than a farmer's child who thinks he's clever. I did not say. I just looked at him, patient, the way I'd promised the dust his pony kicked up a year ago, and let him do his own arithmetic. He bought the fish at Goro's price. The whole price. And then he tried, casually, sweating a little, to buy the cart. And Goro, glorious, gruff, catching on fast now, said the cart wasn't for sale, but that Ishibe would be carting its own goods to market from now on. Thank you. And would remember the fair traders who dealt with them well. Which was Goro telling a man who'd cheated us for years that the cheating was over, dressed up as courtesy. First face slap, delivered by my father in his own voice, and I was prouder of that than of the cart. The merchant left with his whole-priced fish and no cart and a great deal to think about, and he was not laughing. The trouble with a good thing is that a good thing travels. Carts that float over the stones. It went up the road with the merchant, and up the road with every trader who saw our whole fish arrive whole, and it went past the market towns, and I knew it would. I'd counted on it and dreaded it in the same breath it went, eventually toward the capital, where the men who came for taxes lived, and the lords those men served, and the king above them all. Wealth in a poor valley is not a secret you get to keep. Wealth is a light in the dark, and things with eyes turn toward light. Goro knew it too. The night after the merchant left, he sat by the fire turning a fish over and over in his hands the way he'd done the first time. Only this time his face wasn't wonder. It was dread. They'll hear of us, he said low to Sai, thinking I was asleep. A poor village don't draw eyes. A rich one does. The Lord's men, the taxmen, a village that suddenly got carts and fish and letters and coin. He shook his head. We were safer poor. Sa'i, God help me. I think we were safer poor. I lay on my mat with my eyes shut, 5 years old, listening, and I did not feel dread. I felt the old, cold sales director part of me stretch and wake, the part that had spent 30 years turning the attention of powerful people from a threat into an asset. Because Goro was right, the light was lit, the eyes were turning, and you cannot unlight a light. But attention was not by itself danger. Attention was raw material. A lord who hears of a rich, clever village can send men to take it, or a village clever enough can arrange to be worth far more to that lord standing than stripped, worth more as a friend than as a carcass. My whole first life had been walking into rooms full of people more powerful than me, and walking out having made myself indispensable to them. I knew how to do this. It was the one thing Koji had truly known how to do. We're not safe or poorer, Papa, I thought in the dark, listening to my father dread the coming eyes. We're just easier to eat poor. Rich and clever, we get a choice. Let them come. When they come, we won't hide from the eyes. We'll give them something to look at. And I began, lying there between my sleeping parents, to plan the next thing because a springed cart was a fine face to show the capital. But a cart alone wasn't enough leverage against a crown. I needed the village bigger, warmer, stronger, free of the endless labor that kept it small. I needed the water to work for us the way it worked in the weirs, not just fishing while we slept, but grinding, lifting, pounding, freeing every pair of hands in Ishibe to make more than they ate. I needed a wheel that the river turned. Every morning in Ishibe began with the same sound, the thud, thud, thud of women pounding rice. They stood over hollowed logs with heavy wooden pestles, and they pounded the hull off the grain, hour after hour, before they could cook it, and they did it every single day. Because you can't store hulled rice long, it goes rancid, so every day's rice had to be pounded fresh. It was the invisible tax on the whole village. Add up every woman's arms over every morning of every year, and Ishibe spent a staggering fraction of its total human strength just knocking the skin off its food before it could eat. That labor was mine to steal, and the thief was already running past the village day and night, doing nothing but making noise. The creek, the same water that fished for us in the weirs, could pound our rice, grind our grain, lift our loads free, endless, tireless, working through the night while every soul slept. All it needed was a wheel to grab it, and a way to turn the wheels turning into a pounding or a grinding. And I'd known the shape of that since my first life. When I'd watched an old restored mill turn on a school trip, I'd been too busy to enjoy. But I was 6 now, and I was in a race. The race was against my own body and against my father's fear, and the two were tangled together. Because I'd fainted again. Not from the mill, from everything, from too much at once. The village was changing so fast under my nudging that I couldn't stop nudging. And one gray afternoon, planning the mill in my head while pretending to nap, I'd pushed the machine past its line and gone under, properly under, for a frightening span of minutes, and woken to Goro's gray face and Sai's terrible calm and a house full of dread. And Goro clamped down harder than he ever had. This wasn't no more tablets anymore. This was Goro forbidding me the woodyard, forbidding me the creek, assigning AI to watch me, sweet steady AI, who took the job seriously and followed me like a second shadow with orders to fetch him the moment my face went strange. He was terrified in a way that had curdled past reason, and I understood exactly why. Because I'd finally that season pieced together the thing under all his fear. Say told me quietly when Goro was out. Goro'd had a brother. Older. Clever, the family had said, the kind of clever that draws the eye. He'd died young of a fever in the gap between 2 and 6 that swallowed Ishibe's children, and Goro had watched it, and something in Goro had decided wordlessly, forever, that clever and dead were the same thing wearing 2 faces. And now here was his son, clever past nature, collapsing on hillsides, and every feint was his brother dying again, over his shoulder, in his boy. That broke something open in me, because I'd been treating his cage as a problem to route around. It wasn't a problem. It was a wound. My father was not being unreasonable. My father was reliving the worst thing that had ever happened to him, every time my eyes rolled up. And still, this is the terrible part. I couldn't stop. The mill was too important. Winter was coming, and winter in Ishibe was a slow siege. Cold, dark, hungry. The season the fever came, the season the gap opened. A mill freed hands. Freed hands could gather more wood, tend more smoke fires, do more before dark. And the same water power that ground rice could, I already saw drive kilns and bellows and heat warmth in a valley where cold killed. The mill wasn't a convenience. It was, downstream, the thing that closed the very gap my father was terrified of. I was trying to build the cure for the exact fear that was caging me, and I couldn't tell him that, because telling him meant telling him what I was. So I did it the only way left. I did it slow, in pieces, through other hands, from inside the cage. I couldn't go to the woodyard, so I brought the woodyard to me. AI watched me. Fine, I made AI my hands. I'd sit with her, resting, looking like a boy playing, and I'd get her to whittle a little paddle wheel with me, a toy, a plaything for the shallows. We set it in the creek, and the water turned it, round and round, and the smaller children loved it. And it was a game children play, and AI, sharp AI who'd learned her letters faster than any of us, watched that toy turn under the water's push, and I watched her start to think. It never stops, I said to her, 6 years old, lying back in the grass, letting the thought seem idle. The water turns it all day. All night. It never gets tired. I yawned. Wouldn't it be something if the turning did work, like the pounding? If the water pounded the rice instead of your mother's arms? I went very still, the way Sei went still, and looked from me to the little turning toy, and I saw the idea take root in a mind good enough to grow it. It was AI who took it to Taku, not me. I was barred from the woodyard. I, older, trusted, allowed, carried the notion in as her own wondering. And Taku, poor Taku, who by now had learned that when a strange idea arrived through one of these children, it was worth building, Taku took it up. And I fed it to him the same laundered way, through AI, through the toy, through fussing questions, relayed secondhand. A piece a day, resting between, until the shape of a mill stood assembled in Taku's own head, and he believed he'd raised it himself. The design I steered them to was the simplest that would work, an undershot wheel, because Ishibe's creek was too small to build a great overshot mill with a raised race, but it ran quick and steady, and a wheel with paddles dipping into that quick flow would turn well enough. Mount the wheel on a stout axle. Off the axle, a set of cams pegs, really, offset lugs that as the axle turned, would catch the tails of pivoted wooden hammers and lift them and let them fall, thud, into hollowed mortars of grain. A trip hammer rice mill. The water lifts the hammer, gravity drops it, the water lifts it again, forever, all night, for free. I'd seen them in 100 old photographs and I could see this one hole. Taku built the wheel first and it turned, and half the village came to watch a wheel turn in the creek, which tells you how little happened in Ishibe. Then he built the trip hammers, cursing magnificently the whole time because getting the cam pegs spaced so the hammers fell in a staggered rhythm instead of all at once, and jamming the axle took him 3 tries and I couldn't stand over him to fix it. So I had to fix it through AI carrying my fussing back and forth. What if the pegs weren't all in a line, Uncle Taku? What if they were spread around the axle like the petals of a flower until he spaced them, right? And the hammers fell 1, 2, 3, 4 in a rolling rhythm and the axle turned smooth. The morning the mill first pounded a full load of rice by itself, with not one human arm lifting one pestle, the women of Ishibe stood along the bank and watched the water do their work, and some of them cried. I understood why. I'd stolen back a piece of every one of their lives. That thud that had begun every morning of every woman's life in this valley now came from the creek, tireless, and their arms were free, and their mornings were their own. And the shape of what a day could hold in Ishibe changed forever. In one turning wheel. I didn't stop at the mill because I couldn't, because winter was coming, and the mill was only the first half of what the water had to do. The second half was heat, and heat, in a forested valley, meant charcoal. Ishibe burned raw wood, smoky, quick, hungry, giving up its heat fast and dirty. But wood cooked slow in a sealed mound, starved of air until it drove off its smoke and water, and became charcoal, burned hot and clean and steady, half the weight for more of the heat. And this was the winter-killing part. It burned without choking a closed house with smoke. Charcoal meant a home you could keep warm through a long night without smoking your children sick. Charcoal meant hot water, cheaply for washing and warmth. And charcoal, downstream, meant a smith's forge hot enough to make real iron tools, and kilns hot enough to make real pottery instead of the coarse gray stuff that cracked. I laundered the charcoal kilns the same way through Taku, through play, in pieces from the cage, and by the first hard frost Ishibe had a charcoal mound smoking on the hillside, and a stock of black hot burning fuel laid in for winter, and the houses were warmer than they had ever been in the memory of anyone living. Sei kept a pot of hot water on the coals all day now for no reason but that she could, and washed my hands in warm water like it was a small daily miracle. Which in this world it was, and the toy nearly buried Uncle Taku alive, because along the way, resting, 6 years old, needing a thing that was only a toy to keep Goro from smelling the mill, I'd made the children a bamboo copter, a little cross of light bamboo blades on a stick. You spin the stick between your palms and let go, and it flies, whirs straight up into the air and hangs a moment, and drifts down, a spinning seed made on purpose. I'd made it as camouflage, honestly. A harmless plaything, so the village would think the headman's odd boy was just a boy who made toys. It went through the children of Ishibe like a fever. Every child wanted one. Then the children of the 2 nearest villages come to trade, saw them fly and had to have them, and their parents, who'd never seen anything fly on purpose, wanted them too. And they could only be made properly by one man, because the blades had to be pitched just so, or they wouldn't lift. And that man was Taku. And Taku found himself, that winter, with a workshop full of unmended plows and roofs, while the whole district beat a path to his door, begging for a spinning bamboo toy. I cursed the day, he told me, mock furious, holding up a fistful of order tallies, buried in bamboo shavings. The day you showed me that flying thing, I curse it. I'll die under a mountain of these cursed whirligigs, and they'll write on my grave, "Here lies Taku, killed by a toy." But he was grinning under the grumble, because the whirligigs sold, and the mill worked, and the carts floated, and Uncle Taku, the overworked village fixer, had become, without quite noticing, the busiest and most prosperous craftsman for 2 days. Walk in any direction, and he loved every cursing minute of it. That was the shape of what I was building. Not just me rising, but Taku rising, I rising, the whole village lifting together, everyone's hands worth more because of what they could now make. The village changed visibly that winter, and it changed the way a place changes when the siege lifts. No one died. That's the thing I hold on to from that winter. The cold came and the dark came, and the old fever season came, and the houses were warm with charcoal, and the stores were full of smoked fish and mill-pounded rice, and the smoke didn't choke the little ones, and the gap between 2 and 6 did not open. Ishibe went into winter braced for the shrine, the way it always had, and came out into spring with every child it had started with. I don't know if I can explain what that did to the village. They'd spent generations losing children to winter as a fact of the world, like weather, and the winter had come and taken no one. It was the first time in living memory, and people started arriving. Word of a warm, fed, prosperous village travels farther and faster than word of any toy, and families from thinner valleys began drifting up our track, a few at first, then more. A widow with 2 children, a whole struggling household, come to see if the stories of the village where no one starved and the water did the work were true. Goro, headman, had to start deciding who could stay, which was a new and heady problem. Not how do we survive, but how do we grow. Ishibe swelled past its old count, new houses going up, new hands to feed and to use. The free hands the mill and the weirs gave us went into new terraces up the slope, more paddy cut and banked and flooded through the spring, more rice ground to feed the mouths arriving, because a village that grows its people without growing its fields is just a slower kind of famine, and I'd have died before I let Ishibe learn that lesson the hard way. Sai watched all of it, and Sai, my sharp-eyed mother who had known since the stone tower that something lived behind my child's face, sat with me one evening by the warm coals, alone, and did not pretend anymore. Haru, quiet, level, the fish, the letters, the cart, the wheel, the black fuel. She counted them on her fingers, watching my face. 1 child, 6 years old. She let it sit. This isn't cleverness. I've seen clever children. Clever children are clever at one thing, and they're wrong about the rest, and they're children. You're never wrong, and you're never a child, not underneath. Her still sharp eyes held mine, and there was no fear in them, only a mother reaching the bottom of a long, patient question. Where does it come from? What is in my son? I looked at my mother across the warm coals, and every instinct I had, the old cold laundering instinct, reached for a lie, for a deflection, for the clever words that would move her off it, and I was so tired of it. 6 years of being smaller than I was, of laundering every thought through play, of watching my father relive his brother's death every time I pushed too hard, of loving these 2 people with everything I had, and never once letting them see the whole of who was in the boy they held. I almost told her. Right there, the parking lot, the phone, the number I never dialed, the whole impossible truth. But Goro came in stamping snow off his feet, filling the doorway, and the moment closed and I said nothing. And Sai let it close, and we both knew it wasn't finished. Because I was going to have to tell them. I could feel it coming like the winter had come. My body was failing under the weight of what I carried. I'd fainted too many times, and the next faint might be the one I didn't wake from. And I could not keep doing all of this alone, in secret, in a cage, laundering my whole self through toys. I needed my parents to know not to be managed, not to be routed around, but to know and to help, the way I'd needed Sai's hands and never her understanding. I was tired of being useful to the people I loved while they never got to love the real me. I died of that once. I lay awake that night between them, warm for once, in a house full of charcoal heat, in a village where no child had died, and I decided I was going to tell them. Not the truth of the parking lot that was too much, too strange. It would sound like the very curse Ute had named, but something. Enough of the truth to stop the lie. Enough that they could help me carry it, so I stopped collapsing under it alone. And far off, past the warm valley and the full stores and the turning wheel, on a road I hadn't seen yet, other eyes had already turned toward Ishibe's light. A regional lord named Saburo of the old grain clans heard that season of a peasant village grown fat and strange carts that floated, water that ground rice, black fire that warmed houses, children who read. A toy village his men called it, laughing. Lord Saburo did not laugh. Lord Saburo heard rich and undefended and ripe, and he marked Ishibe in his mind the way I had once marked a merchant in the dust. The light was lit. The eyes had turned, and I didn't know it yet. Warm between my sleeping parents, but the easy part of my second life was over. I was going to die keeping this secret, not maybe. I could feel it the way you feel, whether in a bad knee. The faints were getting worse, not more frequent. I'd learned to ration, to work in pieces, to rest but deeper. The last one had held me under for a quarter of an hour, and when I surfaced there had been a long gray moment where I didn't know my own name, either of them, and that terrified me more than anything had in 2 lives. Because if the mind that was me could flicker like a lamp in the wind, then one night the wind would win and I'd go out, and this borrowed boy would either die or wake up as someone else. And either way, Koji Tanaka would have failed the one promise he'd been reborn to keep. And the thing killing me was the secret, the aloneness of it. 6 years of laundering every thought through toys and games and other people's mouths, of never once setting down the whole weight of what I carried, of running an engine in a child's body with no one to help me tend it. In my first life I'd carried everything alone too. Every deal, every crisis, walled off, needing no one, and I died of exactly that, alone in the snow. I could feel the same shape closing around this life. Carry it all yourself. Let no one in, be useful, never known, die of it. Not again. I decided to tell them. And then I spent a week too afraid to, because here was the trap. The truth was the curse. If I said I lived before, I died an old man in a world of iron and glass and light without fire, and I woke inside your son. That was not a confession. That was a confirmation of everything Ute had said over my cradle, and everything Goro's fear had built into a wall. Fate. Special guard him. To Goro, who watched his clever dead brother in every feint. Your son is a spirit wearing a dead man's mind was not something you survived being. It was something the shrine handled, so I couldn't tell the true truth. But I could tell a truth, a smaller one, a shape of it that would explain the fish and the letters and the wheel and the feints without lighting the word curse on fire. And I built it. Over that week, the way I built everything carefully, in pieces, testing every joint. I would tell them there was a voice that I heard in my head, a voice that taught me things, words, crafts, the shape of a trap, the pitch of a blade, that it was where the ideas came from. And that holding on to it, listening to it, was what made me fall down. Not a spirit that possessed me, a gift that overflowed me, a thing that happened to me that I didn't ask for and couldn't fully control. That frightened me too. It was, I told myself, mostly true. There was a voice teaching me. It was me, 52, dead in a parking lot. But me was closer to the truth than a lie, and it put the fear where it belonged, not on what my son is, but on what my son suffers. Turn the curse into an affliction. Turn the thing to be exorcised into the child to be protected. I still couldn't make myself start. Say started it for me. Of course she did. She caught me one gray morning in the woodyard corner where I thought no one could see, sitting with my back to the fence, doing the one thing I was forbidden, driving my mind at full effort, working out a problem, my face gone still and old and far away, no toy in my hands, no game, no cover, just a 6-year-old sitting alone with the specific inward look of a man doing hard arithmetic. And I felt the fizz start at the edges. The light going thin because I'd pushed again. I always pushed, and Sai's hands were on my shoulders before I went over, easing me down, and her face was above me as the gray came up, and she wasn't afraid, and she wasn't calm. She was done waiting, done pretending. And as the world thinned, she said low and fierce, the words I'd been too much of a coward to say first, tell me, whatever it is. Tell me, or I'll lose you doing it alone, and I won't. I won't lose you to a thing you wouldn't say. I came back a few minutes later on the ground with my head in her lap, and Goro was there. I had run for him, as ordered, filling the sky over me, gray-faced, and Sei looked up at her husband and said quietly, sit down, both of us, he's going to tell us. Aren't you, Haru? It wasn't a question. It was the door I hadn't been able to opened for me, so I told them. I told them in the house by the coals with the door shut, the three of us close, and I'll be honest, I'd planned every word, the whole careful laundered shape of it, the voice, the gift, the affliction, and I got about 4 words in, and the plan fell apart, because I looked at my father's terrified face, and I could not do to him, in this of all moments, the thing Koji did to everyone, manage him. So I told them badly, truly crying, which I hadn't planned, the child's body doing the crying for me and the man inside letting it. I told them there was a voice that taught me things, words and crafts, the trap and the wheel and the black fire, all of it, come from somewhere I didn't choose. I told them it was why I fell down, that holding the voice, listening to it, was too heavy for me, and if I listened too long the light went out. I told them I was afraid, that I'd been afraid this whole time of the shrine, of the word fate, of frightening them, of dying with it all locked inside me. I told them I'd hidden it because I thought if they knew they'd fear me, or send me to Ute, or love me less. And then I said the thing that wasn't in any plan, the thing Koji Tanaka never once managed to say to a single soul in 52 years. I need help, I said, Papa. I can't carry it by myself. It's too heavy and I keep falling down and I need you to help me, please. I don't want to do it alone anymore. And then, because it was true, and because I was 6 and crying and past all my cleverness, I'm so happy. I'm so happy to be here with you. I don't care about the voice. I don't care about any of it. I just don't want to leave you. That's all. That's all I want. To stay with you. Goro made a sound I'd never heard from him. I braced for the fear, for the word curse, for the wall to go up, for the shrine. We'll take him to the shrine. That was the calculated risk of the whole confession, that fear would win. Fear didn't win. Love won, and it won because I'd finally, for once in 2 lives, asked for help instead of offering usefulness. And there is nothing on this earth a father like Goro can refuse a weeping child who says, I need you. He didn't say a word about curses. He crossed the space between us and gathered me up off the mat into those enormous arms, the mountain of a man who sang badly and panicked at my crying, and he held me against his chest so hard it hurt, and I felt him shaking, and Sai's arms came around us both, and the 3 of us knelt there by the coals in a knot, and Goro said into my hair, his voice wrecked, then we'll carry it. You hear me? Whatever it is, a voice, a gift, the gods, I don't care, we'll carry it together. You're not alone. You've never been alone. You stubborn. You should have told me. All this time you were falling down and hiding it, letting me think you should have told me. I'm your father. I'm your father, Haru. Whatever's in you, it came in my son, and I'll guard my son to my last breath, not from the shrine. From anyone. Do you understand, anyone? And that was it. That was the wall down. The gulf crossed. The thing that Koji reached for across a snowy parking lot and never touched a father's arms. A mother's. The whole weight of being known and held anyway. I'd spent 1 entire life and 6 years of another, making myself useful so no one would ask whether I was loved because I was afraid of the answer. And here was the answer. Holding me by the coals, telling me it didn't care what was in me. It would guard me from anyone. I cried until I had nothing left. and they held me the whole time, and it was the best thing that had ever happened to me in either life, and I hadn't had to be clever for 1 second of it. It changed everything, and it changed it in the direction I'd hoped and hadn't dared expect, because now I had hands. Real hands. Knowing hands. Goro stopped being the cage and became the shield he still forbade me, the deep, dangerous, faint until you don't wake work. But now he understood it, and instead of just saying no more, he said not alone, not too long, and you rest when Sae says rest. Sae became my mind's manager, the way I had become my operations manager. She'd sit with me while I worked in pieces, watch my face for the going gray, pull me back before the line. Take the ideas from me when the light started to thin and carry them out to Taku and I herself, so I didn't have to hold them past what my body could bear. I could set the weight down now. I could hand it to someone. The engine still ran, but I wasn't the only one tending it, and I stopped falling down, because for the first time the load was shared. I hadn't just gained help. I'd gained the thing I'd died without. I'd stopped being alone. Yutei came 3 days later, and I was afraid all over again, because if the confession had gone anywhere in the village, if a word of the boy hears a voice had reached the shrine, then the masked woman who'd said guard him over my cradle would have come to a very different conclusion about what needed guarding, and from whom. She came alone, at dusk, to the house. Goro went stiff and stepped in front of me, the shield already working. Sai's hand found my shoulder, and Utei's calm carved face turned to all of us, said she wished to speak with the boy, alone, and Goro said no flat, and Utei inclined her head and said, then with all of you. It does not matter. What I have to say, you should all hear. She sat. She looked at me a long moment through the eye slits of the mask, the same reading look that had unnerved me at my naming, and she said, the village does not starve. The children live through winter, the water works, and the carts float, and the little ones read their own names in the dirt. A pause. I have kept this shrine 40 years. I have watched more children go into the ground than I can hold in my mind, and this winter, for the first time in my keeping, I put no child in the ground. Something moved behind the mask that might have been the mouth. You did that, this one did that. She nodded at me. He has a gift, Goro said. Low, guarded, ready to fight. That's all. A gift, not a curse. I won't hear the word curse in this house. I did not say curse. Utei said mildly. I said fate. 6 years ago I looked at an infant and I saw a fate on him. And men in my position, when they see a fate they don't understand, they call it curse, and they take the child to the shrine, and the child is never clever again. Her masked head tilted. I did not do that. Have you wondered why? None of us breathed. Because I have seen a great many children, Utei said, and I know the difference between a child a fate has come to destroy and a child a fate has come through. I did not name yours to mark him for the shrine, Goro. I named it so that when others came and others will come, others with less sight and more greed, who will hear strange lucky boy and see a thing to seize or a thing to burn. I named it so that I, the shrine, the one voice in this valley they cannot easily gainsay, would already have declared him blessed and fated, and mine to watch. A thing under the shrine's protection. The eyes found me again. I have been shielding you, child, since before you could speak. From the exact suspicion you have spent 6 years so carefully, so needlessly, hiding from me. I sat there 6 years old and understood that I had misread the most important person in my early world completely, that the masked figure I'd feared as the axe had been. The whole time. The roof. That she'd known something was in me from the cradle, and had chosen, out of 40 years of burying children and 1 winter of burying none, to call it blessing before anyone could call it curse, and to stand between it and the world. Whatever teaches you, Utei said, rising, gathering her staff. I do not need to know its name, and I advise you never to say it aloud to anyone but these two. A glance at my parents. Let the village believe the gods favor the headman's son. It is not far from true, and it is armor. Keep making the children live through winter. I will keep the word blessed over you as long as I keep this shrine. At the door she paused, and the calm carved mask turned back once. And Goro, stop being afraid your clever son will die of being clever. He won't. But greedy men will come for what he's built. Be afraid of the right thing. Then she was gone into the dusk, and the 3 of us sat in the cold warmth with the whole shape of my world. Rearranged the shrine and ally, the parents knowing, the secret set down, the aloneness broken. That night I lay between them, warm, and I did what I hadn't been able to do in years. I set the whole thing down and just rested. Truly rested. Sei's mind guarding mine. Goro's arm across us both. Yutei's word blessed laid over the shrine like a roof. I and Taku turning my ideas into wood. The mill pounding rice in the dark for free. The stores full. The children alive. The foundation was unbreakable now. I could feel it under everything. Solid. The way a good structure feels solid when you stand on it and it doesn't move. I had at last the thing Koji died reaching for. I had a family that knew me and held me anyway. And I needed all of it. Because Utei was right. And I already knew she was right because I'd said it myself to the dark weeks ago. The light is lit. The eyes have turned. A regional lord named Saburo had heard rich and undefended. And past Saburo, larger and slower and hungrier, the crown itself was beginning to hear of a peasant village that made carts float over stones, and the crown, when it hears of new wealth in a poor corner, does not come with a merchant's sneer. It comes with soldiers and officials and the smiling terrible word honor, which means costs and taxes and eyes and a boot on the neck dressed up as a gift. I lay warm between my sleeping parents, unafraid for once of dying, and turned my whole rested mind to the next problem, not a trap, not a wheel, but a king, because the men from the court were already on the road. The man from the court arrived with a smile, an escort of 10 armed men, and a scroll, and in my old life I'd learned that a smile, an escort, and a document are exactly how the powerful say, "We're taking this," while making you thank them for it. He rode up the track in early spring when I was 5, and Ishibi was fat with its first real surplus, and the whole village went silent and gray the way it went when the taxmen came, because armed men from the direction of the capital meant one thing in the memory of everyone here, and that thing was loss. Goro walked out to meet him with his headband face on, and his back straight and his heart, I knew, in his throat. And then the rider took off his helmet, and Goro stopped, and something happened to my father's face that I had never seen. It fell open. Years fell off it, and he said a name like it hurt. Renji. The man swung down off his horse, and the two of them stood looking at each other, and then Renji crossed the ground and gripped Goro by both shoulders, and they were laughing rough, disbelieving. And Sai came out and made a sound, and the man caught her hand, and I understood, watching, that this was not a stranger. This was old. This went back to before me, before Ishibe was strange, to whatever Goro and Sai had been young. Renji was a distant cousin of the royal house, a minor branch, the kind that gets a name and no land, close enough to the crown to be trusted with its business and far enough to be sent to do the unglamorous parts of it. He'd grown up. It came out that evening by the coals in the same district as Goro and Sai. The three of them children together before Renji's blood pulled him toward the capital, and the other two stayed in the dirt. Shrewd, dry, quick-eyed. He wore the court's manners like a coat he could take off, and when he took it off with Goro and Sai, he was just a man who'd missed his oldest friends for 20 years. But he hadn't ridden the long road with 10 soldiers to reminisce. And he told us why over the coals, dropping his voice, glancing at the door, because what he had to say was the kind of thing a courtman wasn't supposed to say plainly. "The crown has heard of you." He looked at Goro, then sharply, appraisingly at me, because of course the stories all pointed at the headman's odd son, and Renji was too clever not to have noticed. Carts that float over stones, water that grinds grain, a village grown rich in a poor corner, it's traveled all the way up, and when new wealth reaches the crown's ear from a place with no lord to speak for it, he spread his hands. "They want to honor you. That's the word in the scroll I carry. Honor. Honor," Goro repeated flat. "A garrison," Renji said, "posted here to protect this valuable village. Officials to help you administer your new prosperity. And in due course, a proper assessment of your," he chose the word carefully, "contributions. Taxes, Goro, surveillance, a permanent boot, dressed as a gift." He rubbed his face. "I asked to be the one sent. Do you understand? I didn't want you to open your door to a stranger who saw only a fat, undefended prize. I came so it would be me." Goro's face had gone hard and closed. "So we refuse it." "You can't refuse it," Renji said quietly. "It isn't an offer. It's an announcement wearing an offer's clothes. Refuse the crown's honor, and you're a village that spurned the crown, and then they don't send me with 10 men and a smile. They send someone else with 100, and no smile." He shook his head. "You're past the point of hiding, old friend. The eyes are on you. The only question left is what you make them into." And that was the sentence I'd been waiting a whole year to hear someone else say out loud, because it was the whole game, the only game. The game Koji Tanaka had spent 30 years playing in glass towers. Goro wanted to fight it. Every instinct in him the peasant's ancient, correct instinct that the crown is weather, and weather takes wanted to bar the door and pull the weirs and go poor again. Back to safe, back to invisible. And I understood it, and I let him say it, all of it, by the coals that night. Then I asked if I could speak. They let me. That was new too. The whole reason I'd broken open my secret was so that in a moment exactly like this one, I could stop laundering my mind through toys and just think out loud as myself and have my parents hear it and weigh it. Say watched my face for the going gray. Goro leaned in, and I laid it out for them the way I'd once laid out a market entry strategy for a boardroom. Except now the stakes were my family, and the board was a king. "We accept," I said. "All of it, gladly, and we make it ours." Goro started to object, and I kept going in pieces, resting on the pauses, because I could feel Sai's eyes checking me, and I paced myself against them. "Think about what the garrison actually is. Papa, right now Ishibe is rich and has no soldiers. That's not safe, that's prey. Lord Saboro's already heard of us. You know he has? A rich village with no swords is a peach on a low branch, and sooner or later a Saburo picks it. But a village with a royal garrison I let it land is a village no local lord dares touch. Touch us. And he's not stealing from peasants. He's spitting on the crown. The garrison isn't a boot on our neck. It's a wall around us. An army paid for by the king, standing between us and every greedy noble in the region." Renji across the coals went very still, and then he smiled. Slow, the coat-off smile, because he was clever enough to hear where I was going, and to be surprised the voice was coming from a 5-year-old. "And it matters whose army," I said. "Papa, the garrison commander is going to live here, command here, have the crown's ear on what happens here." I looked at Renji. "So we make sure the commander is a friend. We make sure it's you." Renji's smile widened. "The officials," I went on. "Administrators who can read and write and keep the crown's records, Papa. We want literate men who owe their comfortable post to us being pleasant and prosperous. we fold them in. We make ourselves the easiest, richest, most loyal-looking village in the whole district to be posted to, so that every official who serves here goes back to the capital saying good things about the headman's family. Every one of them becomes a voice for us at court, without knowing it. That's not surveillance. That's 30 friends in the capital, delivered to our door, at the crown's expense. And the taxes, Goro said hard, the peasant in him not fooled. You've got no clever turn for the taxes, boy. Taxes just take. The taxes we pay, I said, happily, loudly, more than they ask. Goro stared at me like I'd lost my mind. A village that grumbles and hides its wealth looks like it has more to hide, and a crown that suspects hidden wealth digs. But a village that comes forward smiling, that pays its share and then some, that sends the king a gift of its famous goods, and calls itself his humble, loyal Ishibi. I spread my small hands the way Renji had. That village looks poor and generous, looks safe, looks like it's already given everything, so there's nothing left worth seizing. We hide our wealth by being visibly, cheerfully generous with a fraction of it. We don't pay taxes to the crown, Papa. We buy the crown, one loyal-looking gift at a time, and the crown thinks it's collecting. There was a long quiet. The coals ticked, and Renji laughed, softly, and shook his head, and looked at Goro and said, "Where did he learn to think like a premier?" And Goro, my father, who a year ago would have heard all this and been afraid, looked at me for a long moment, and then he did the thing that told me the man from the coal's confession was gone for good and a new man stood in his place. He nodded, slowly, and he said, "All right, we do it the boy's way," and then gruff, covering, but he doesn't strain himself over it. Sai watches him. He works in pieces or not at all. I'll watch him, Sai said. We were, it was decided, going to accept the crown's honor and turn it into armor. And I felt the old sales director part of me, the part that had walked into rooms full of predators and walked out having made them shareholders, wake up all the way and stretch. And for once it felt not like a curse, but like the exact right tool for the exact right job. Renji stayed a week to arrange it, and in that week 2 things happened. The first I revealed carefully to Renji, and only because I judged him a true friend and a necessary channel, the springed cart in full. I showed him the leaf, the shackles, how it worked, and I told him my parents' present, part of the plan that Ishibi wished to send the king a gift, not just fish and cloth, a springed cart, the very marvel the crown had heard of, given freely, as a humble tribute from his loyal village, so that the king's own household might ride smooth over any road in the land. A gift no coin could buy because no one else on earth knew how to make it. The kind of gift that makes a king remember your name warmly. Renji went quiet, holding a leaf spring in his hands, turning it over and said, "You understand this is worth more than the taxes off 10 villages. You're just giving it to him." "I'm giving him a cart," I said. "I'm keeping the knowing how. He gets one marvelous cart and the pleasure of being generously served. We keep the only workshop in the kingdom that can make more. Which of us has really given away the treasure?" Renji looked at me a long moment, the coat all the way off now, and said, "Goro Saie, I have served in the capital 20 years. I have watched grown ministers with gray in their beards fail to see what your 5-year-old just said." He set the leaf down carefully. "Guard him, not from the shrine, from the men I work with." The second thing that happened that week was quieter, and it mattered more to me than kings. I got Renji alone on the last evening, and I asked him a favor that had nothing to do with strategy. I asked it plainly, the way I was learning to ask for things, no laundering, no clever turn, just the truth of wanting. Sai's parents were alive. I'd learned it in pieces over the years, from things Sai didn't say she'd been orphaned from them, not by death but by distance and hardship, sent away young to marry Goro in this far valley. Her mother and father left behind in the district she'd come from, the same district Renji had grown up in. She'd not seen them in 15 years. She thought of them, I knew, on certain evenings when her face went to a far place. She'd never once asked to bring them, because you don't ask for the impossible, and hauling 2 aged parents over a mountain track to a village one bad harvest from famine had always been the impossible. It wasn't impossible anymore. We were rich now, we had springed carts and a garrison coming, and a friend at court with soldiers and horses. "When the crown's caravan comes," I asked Renji, quiet, so Sai wouldn't hear, "with the garrison and the officials, and whatever gifts the king sends back for the cart, can it carry 2 more people up the track? Her mother and father, bring them home. She'll never ask. So I'm asking." Renji looked at me, this dry, shrewd court cousin who'd watched ministers fail to outthink me, and something in his hard, quick face went soft, and he said, "You just turned a king into armor for your whole village, and the thing you actually wanted was to bring your mother her parents." "They're the same want," I said. "Everything I'm building is the same want. I just want everyone home." He didn't answer for a moment, then he gripped my small shoulder, the way he'd gripped Goro's, and said, "I'll bring them. I swear it. Now get some sleep before your mother catches you awake and blames me." He rode out the next morning with the springed cart following behind, hauled by 2 of his men, bound for the capital, and a king carrying our tribute, our loyalty, and the beginning of the whole careful campaign to turn the crown's greedy eye into a shield over Ishibi. And that same season, digging the race deeper for the mill and quarrying stone for the growing village, we found the 2 things I'd hoped we wouldn't. I found the first placer gold flakes and grains in the creek gravel where the new channel cut. The kind of find that in this world doesn't make a village rich. It makes a village dead, because gold under a poor village draws the crown's hand faster than anything on earth, and the crown does not share gold. The crown takes the village and the ground and the people and works them till their bones. And Taku found the second, digging clay for the new kiln's iron ore, good ore, a proper seam of it, which was in its way even more dangerous, because iron is weapons, and a peasant village sitting on an iron mine is a thing kings do not permit to exist unowned. I sat by the coals that night with a pinch of gold flakes in one hand and a lump of red ore in the other, and I did not feel rich. I felt the whole careful structure I'd built shiver, because these two finds could undo all of it, the garrison, the loyalty, the humble and generous act in an instant, the moment word got out. Rich and loyal is armor. Rich and loyal and secretly sitting on gold and iron is a lie the crown executes you for. We hide it, I said quietly to Goro and Sai. The gold we take a little, quietly, never enough to show, and we bury the knowing of it deeper than we bury the gravel it comes from. And the iron, I turned the red ore over the iron, we hide by using it. In plain sight, we tell everyone we're buying ore for the smith, and we make it into the same tools and cart fittings we already make. And no one ever asks where a village that trades so much gets a little iron. We hide the mine inside the workshop. Goro looked at the two things in my small hands, the gold and the iron, the wealth and the danger, and he said, "Lo, every good thing you build, boy, comes with a knife tied to it." "Everything worth having does," I said. "We just have to hold the good end." And far off, on the road to the capital, a springed cart rolled smooth toward a king, while somewhere in a hall of that same capital, a minister named Kaig was hearing, for the first time, of a peasant village grown suspiciously rich, and beginning, behind a smile of his own, to wonder how such a thing might be made to belong to the crown entire. I have engineered a fish trap, a mill, a suspension that made a village rich. The finest thing I ever built. I built with a favor and a caravan, and it was a family put back together. The crown's caravan came up the track 2 months later, long enough for a king to decide, a garrison to be raised, and Renji to ride to the far district for Sei's parents and back. And it came the way the crown does things. Enormous, deliberate, a statement dressed as generosity. Renji at the head with a proper company of soldiers, a garrison far larger than the 10 who first rode up. The men Ishibe was now to host. Behind them, officials in good cloth on good horses, the administrators who'd keep the crown's records and, if I'd read it right, become our 30 unknowing friends. And behind them, the gifts, because a king who receives a cart no coin can buy does not send back a thank you. He sends back a mountain, so that no one may say he was outgiven by peasants. Bolts of cloth dyed colors Ishibe had never worn. Iron tools, good ones, which I noted with private satisfaction because they let me buy more iron openly and hide the mine that much deeper inside the workshop. Sacks of salt, precious salt, which meant more preserved fish, more surplus, more armor. And, because Renji knew his king and his king's sense of humor, a truly absurd quantity of rice wine, jar upon jar of it, a river of alcohol, enough to drown the whole village, which Goro received with the stunned face of a man who has never in his life had too much of anything and does not know the etiquette of the situation. The whole village turned out. The whole village stared. Ishibe, which a year and more ago braced grey and silent when armed men came up the track, now lined the road to gawk at its soldiers, its officials, its mountain of a king's regard, and I watched the fear that had run under this place like an underground river for generations begin, in the faces along that road to dry up. They weren't prey anymore. They were the village the king sent gifts to. You could see them learning to stand differently, but I wasn't watching the cloth or the salt or the river of wine. I was watching the last cart in the caravan, the small plain one at the very back, because Renji had caught my eye as he rode in and given me the smallest nod, and I knew what was in it, and my heart was doing something my careful mind couldn't govern. 2 old people climbed down from that last cart, stiff from the road, blinking in the light, a bent old man and a small white-haired woman, looking around the strange rich village with the lost, uncertain faces of people who've been told something impossible and haven't dared believe it. Sei was beside me. I felt her go rigid. I felt her stop breathing. Then she made a sound. I had no name for not a word. Older than words, and she was running, my composed, sharp-eyed mother running like a girl down the road with her hands out, and the old woman turned at the sound and her face broke open, and the two of them crashed together in the dust of Ishibe's road. Mother and daughter, 15 years and 2 days. Mountain road and a lifetime of never again collapsing into one embrace. Both of them sobbing, the old man's arms coming around them both, the 3 of them a single shaking knot in the road, while the whole village and the whole caravan stood still and let them have it. I stood back and watched, and I did not do arithmetic. For once in 2 lives I did no arithmetic at all. I just watched my mother get her mother back, and I cried, standing there, 7 years old. And I understood that this was the thing all of it had been for. Not the wealth, not the king, not the armor. The wealth was just the tool. This was the thing the tool was for. I'd spent a whole first life confusing the tool for the purpose, chasing the money as if the money were the point, dying alone with a full account and an empty road. And here, watching Sai hold her weeping mother in the dust, I finally understood, all the way down, what money was for. It was for this. It had only ever been for this. Goro came and stood beside me and put his huge hand on my head and said nothing, because his face was wet too. And we watched together as the family came apart and back together in the road. Later, much later, Sai found me alone. Her eyes were red, and her face was open in a way I'd never seen it. All the sharpness melted. She knelt in front of me and took my face in both her hands and looked at me for a long time. And she didn't ask how, or who, or arrange it into strategy the way her clever mind arranged everything. She just said, "You did this." My whole life I told myself I'd never see them again, and I made my peace with it. And my strange, blessed son reached out one small hand and undid it. Her thumbs moved on my cheeks. "Whatever you are, Haru, whatever voice speaks to you, thank you for being it in my house." I'd repaired a mill and a cart and a trap. This was the only thing I ever built that made me feel like I'd earned the second life I was given. The good things, as Goro said, come with knives tied to them, and the knives came fast that season. The first was almost comic, and it was the grandfathers. Yuna and Kohana were older now, and they were mine, my first students, my workshop underfoot, the loud one and the quiet one, and they'd spent years circling each other over the tablets and, to my continuing horror, over me, which had been a children's thing, a nuisance I filed under later. It stopped being a children's thing when the grandfathers got involved. Yuna's grandfather was Tetsu, a stern, dried-up old farmer with a voice like a rake on stone. Kohana's was Iwa, equally stern, equally dried up, and Tetsu's lifelong rival in the small eternal wars of a small village, the two of them having competed over paddy boundaries and shrine seating and the relative merits of their families since before Goro was born. And both of them had that season done the same arithmetic. And it was arithmetic even I respected for its ruthlessness. The headman's son is the most valuable child ever born in this valley. Bind him to my granddaughter, and my line rises with his. So they came separately to Goro, each to propose a betrothal his granddaughter to me, and when each learned the other had come too, it became a war, conducted with terrible dignity through gifts and hints and pointed remarks at the shrine. Tetsu insisting Yuna was the boy's obvious match, Iwa insisting Kohana was, both of them treating a child's marriage prospects as the decisive campaign of their long rivalry. And they enlisted the girls, who being young and competitive and already primed, took up the war with enthusiasm, so that I could no longer sit in the workshop without Yuna and Kohana staking rival claims to the ground beside me, while their grandfathers glowered at each other across the yard. I found it mortifying beyond any invention I'd ever attempted. I was inside a 52-year-old man being betrothed by committee to two little girls. Sei found it the funniest thing that had happened in years, and was no help whatsoever. Goro, cornered by two furious grandfathers, kept saying the boy was far too young to speak of such things, which was true and satisfied no one. I filed the whole disaster, as I filed everything under later, and privately resolved that whatever solved it, it would not be me choosing one girl over the other, because I had a use for both of them. That had nothing to do with betrothal and everything to do with the fact that Yuna was fearless and Kohana was precise, and together they were the best two hands in my rising workshop. Later, but the grandfathers would not wait patiently for later, and I knew it. The second knife was not comic at all, and it came from Lord Saburo. I'd known he was out there, the regional noble of the old grain clans who'd heard rich, undefended, ripe, and marked us. He'd waited, watching, and now that the garrison had come, he couldn't simply take us, touch us, and he'd be spitting on the crown, exactly as I'd designed. So Saburo, being a lord and not a bandit, reached for a lord's weapon instead. He reached for the crown itself. Renji brought the warning. Grim. Saburo had sent word to the capital to Minister Keigi's faction. It turned out the same ambitious premier who'd already begun wondering how a peasant village grown rich might be made to belong to the crown entire. And Saburo's word was poison, precisely aimed. The village of Ishibi is concealing wealth from the crown. It grows suspiciously, impossibly rich. It hoards. It hides gold, and here I went cold. Because either Saburo was guessing, or a whisper of our placer had leaked. And either way, the word gold in a denunciation to the crown was a death sentence being drafted. It hoards what by right belongs to the king. Send men. Assess it. Strip it. If that accusation reaches the king's ear and takes hold, Renji said low by the coals, the garrison won't save you. I won't save you. An assessment party comes, and they dig, and if they find 1 grain of gold you've hidden, it's not a village anymore. It's a crown mine, and you're the peasants who stole from the king. He looked at me. He's found the one true thing to hang you with. What do you do when the accusation is true? Goro's face was gray. Sai's hand found my shoulder, and I sat with the gold knife at our throats and did the only thing I knew how to do, which was to think 3 moves past the man holding it. It didn't matter that our creek gave up only a little gold, flakes, and grains, a modest, steady trickle a man could hide in a fist. It was dangerous not for its size, but for its very existence, because the crown does not weigh gold before it takes a village. It only needs to find 1 grain. Saburo's accusation, I said slowly, is that we hide wealth from the crown, that we're disloyal hoarders, that we keep what belongs to the king. I turned it over. So we make the accusation impossible to believe. Not by defending against it. You can't defend against a dig. The dig finds what it finds. We make it absurd. We make the whole court laugh at the idea that Ishibi hoards from the king. And we do it before the accusation ever gets a hearing. How? Goro said. We flood the throne with generosity, I said. Right now, before Saburo's poison ripens. We send the king a tribute so lavish, so public, so humble, the most famous village in the district, falling over itself to give the crown its finest goods, freely, joyfully, asking nothing, that when Saburo's letter arrives, whispering they hoard, they hide, they keep it from you, the king reads it holding a mountain of gifts, Ishibi just sent him and thinks, hoarding? This village that empties its stores at my feet and calls itself my humblest servant. This absurd loyal little place that sends me carts and fish. And he glanced at the wine jars, returns my own wine with interest. Saburo, you jealous fool, you're seeing gold where there's only devotion. I laid it out fully then in pieces, resting on Sai's watching eyes. We would send a tribute caravan of our own. Down the road Saburo's letter traveled, timed to arrive first. Springed carts, more of them, built openly, now loaded with our famous smoked fish, our best cloth, fine tools. A portion of the very salt and goods the king had sent, given back, transformed and multiplied. And another springed cart as a personal gift to Kage himself, the very minister Saburo was trying to use against us. Flatter the man aiming the knife. Make Kage the recipient of Ishibi's loyal generosity so that when Saburo's accusation crossed his desk, Kage's first instinct was not seize them but these are the people who just sent me a marvelous cart. And this jealous grain lord is trying to make me act against my own useful friends. And the whole thing framed in a humble letter Renji would help us word in proper court language as, your loyal village of Ishibi, blessed by the shrine Ute's word, our armor thriving by the king's gracious protection, sends this humble portion of its small prosperity in gratitude, and begs only to continue serving. Small prosperity, humble portion. A village that says small and humble while handing over a fortune does not look like a village with gold in its creek. It looks like a village that has already given everything and kept nothing worth digging for. We hide the gold, I said, behind a mountain of generosity so large that no one can imagine there's anything left underneath it. Saburo says we hoard. We answer by being visibly impossibly generous, and his accusation dies of its own absurdity, laughed out of the court, before the first shovel ever touches our ground. Goro stared at me for a long moment. Then slowly he grinned a real grin, the grin of a man who has stopped being afraid of the crown and started using it. You're going to answer a man's knife, he said, by burying him in gifts to someone else. I'm going to make his knife look like envy, I said, because that's what it is. We built the tribute caravan in a fever over the following weeks, and I paced myself hard against Sai's watching eyes, working in pieces, resting, because the temptation to drive the machine flat out was enormous, and the price was still the gray. Taku's workshop swamped already, cursing gloriously turned out 2 more springed carts. I organized the loading and the tallies, my manager running the operation while I rested. Yuna and Kohana, war and all, packed fish under Aya's direction, and their grandfathers glowered, and the whole village threw itself into the strange joyful work of being generous to a king on purpose, as strategy, as armor, and Renji carried it down himself. With our humble letter and our lavish gifts and our absurd loyal smallness, racing Saburo's poison to the capital. He won the race. Of course he won it. Saburo was a regional grain lord sending a letter by messenger. We were sending a caravan of the most famous goods in the district, escorted by a royal cousin, timed and aimed. Our tribute reached the throne and reached Kage's own hall, days before Saburo's accusation arrived. And when Saburo's letter finally came, Ishibi hoards, Ishibi hides gold, Ishibi keeps what is the king's, it landed, exactly as I'd designed, on a court still admiring Ishibi's humble mountain of gifts, in the hands of a minister who just received a personal marvel from the very village being denounced. Renji told us how it went, when he returned, and he told it laughing, because it had gone even better than I dared hope. Kage, who I'd flattered without yet meeting, who I did not yet know would become the sharpest knife of all, Kage read Saburo's accusation and, being a shrewd and ambitious man, saw immediately what I'd built. He saw a jealous regional lord trying to use the crown to destroy a rival, and he saw a village that had made itself far more valuable to the crown, loyal and giving than it could ever be stripped and resentful. And this was the part I'd counted on. He saw that if he took Saburo's side and moved against generous, humble, shrine-blessed Ishibi, and it came out that he'd crushed the king's most devoted village on the word of a jealous grain lord, he would look the fool. So Kage did the ambitious man's thing. He protected himself. He dismissed Saburo's accusation before the king, called it what it plainly was, the envy of a lesser lord, and had Saburo publicly rebuked for troubling the crown with petty regional spite against a loyal village. Saburo, who had reached for the crown as a weapon, had the crown turned around in his hand and driven back into him, humiliated before the court, marked now as a troublemaker, a man who'd wasted the king's time with jealousy. His intrigue didn't just fail, it cost him standing. He'd spent a lifetime accumulating. The second face slap, far bigger than the merchant's, and I'd never lifted a hand or raised my voice. I'd answered his knife with a caravan of gifts, and let his own envy be the blade that cut him. Renji finished the telling and shook his head at me across the coals. You have never seen the capital. You are barely 7 years old, and you just destroyed a regional lord from 2 days. Walk away using his own weapon without leaving the valley. He raised a cup of the king's own wine. God help the man who ever aims a knife at you and thinks you'll defend. You don't defend, do you? You just make the knife point back. I let myself take that in the win. The armor holding, Saburo finished, the gold still hidden, the family whole, Sai's parents by the coals, the village standing tall. For one evening I let myself simply have it. Then Renji's face changed, and he set the cup down, and he said, quieter. There's other news from the capital. Bad news. Of a kind, though it isn't aimed at you yet. He glanced at Goro and Sei. There's a scandal at court. The youngest princess, Hinano, has fallen. Kage's faction has moved against her. They mean to strip her of her title and cast her out to be raised in some commoner household, as punishment, and they say, re-education. He met my eyes, and I heard your name spoken. Near the end of it, I don't yet know why, But when a princess falls and a peasant boy's name comes up in the same breath at court, he shook his head. We should be ready to travel. I think Haru, the capital, is about to want to look at you itself. The capital wanted to look at me, so I went to look at the capital, and the first thing I learned there was that a fallen princess is worth more as a leash than as a person. We traveled the 2 days down the mountain road, and 3 more across the plain, into country I'd never seen. And I catalogued all of it, the widening roads, the market towns, the way the crown's presence thickened the closer you got until it was in the very cut of a stranger's coat. I was 8 and small, and I rode in a springed cart, our own, which drew stares the whole way, because word of the floating carts had run ahead of us. And here I was, arriving in one, the boy from the stories, and I let them stare. Renji had counseled it arrive as the marvel they've heard of, he'd said. Be strange and useful, and impossible to simply throw away. That's your armor at court, same as in the valley. The capital itself was the largest thing I'd seen in this life walls, a palace on a rise. More people in one street than in all of Ishibi, and I did not gawk, because Koji had walked into too many towers full of dangerous people to gawk at a big building. I did the thing I'd always done. I read the room, and the room, it turned out, was a trap with a child in it. We were summoned because of the scandal, and the scandal, when it was laid out for us in the cold marble antechambers, was uglier and simpler than any of the court's flowery language admitted. Princess Hinano was the youngest of the king's children, spoiled past saving. Everyone agreed. Vain, cruel to servants, easily led. And she had been led, by Keige's faction, into some indiscretion that I never got the full shape of, and suspected was half-manufactured, a scandal grown in a hothouse precisely so it could be harvested. Because Keige did not actually want the princess punished. Keige wanted the princess usable. A princess in good standing was a piece the king moved. A princess in disgrace, stripped of title, cast out, dependent on whoever housed her for her every scrap of dignity that was a piece Keige could move, quietly, forever. A royal daughter turned into a leash he held, and the household they meant to cast her into, the commoner household chosen for her humiliation and re-education, was, I realized as the officials talked, going to be ours. That was why my name had come up. That was the whole game. Keige had watched Ishibi grow rich, loyal, shrine-blessed, garrisoned. Impossible to simply seize Saburo had proven that seizing us was a fool's road. So Keige had found the subtler road, put a fallen princess in the headman's house. A princess is a permanent crown presence, a permanent reason for the court to inspect, interfere, and hold Ishibi by the collar. She was the leash Saburo's crude accusation had failed to be, and she was being fitted to us in the name of honor always. That word, the great honor of the headman's family being trusted to house and reform a princess. He's putting a spy and a hostage in your home, Renji said grimly, in the antechamber low, wrapped as a gift, and he expects you to be too dazzled by the honor to see the collar. I saw the collar. I'd have seen it in my sleep. And I sat in that cold marble room, 8 years old, and everyone, Renji, Goro, Sae, the officials, Keige's people watching from across the hall, expected me to do what I always did. Find the clever angle, the leverage, the way to turn the leash into armor, the way I'd turn the garrison and the taxes. Then they brought the princess in, and I stopped thinking about strategy. She was maybe 10, older than me by a couple of years and half a head taller, and she came in surrounded by attendants who I understood at a glance were not hers. They were Kage's minders, wearing the smooth blank faces of people paid to watch. And she was, exactly as advertised, insufferable. Her chin was up, her eyes were furious and dry. She looked at the marble room and the officials and my rough peasant family with a contempt so total, so practiced, that it was almost impressive. And when it was explained to her publicly, cruelly, as part of the humiliation that she was to be sent to live in a mud village with a headman and his farmer wife and their strange peasant son, she laughed, a high brittle laugh, and said something so vicious about all of us that Goro's jaw tightened and Sei's hand found my shoulder. Everyone in that room saw a spoiled, hateful, ruined girl. I saw something else, because I'd spent one whole life reading people, and I read her in about 4 seconds. And what I read stopped my clever strategist mind cold. I saw that the fury was dry because she'd cried herself out somewhere private, and would never let them see it again. I saw that the contempt was armor, the exact kind of armor I'd worn my whole first life. The make yourself hard so no one can see, there's nothing holding you up. I saw that the attendants around her were not her friends, had never been her friends, were the people who'd built her scandal and would guard her disgrace, and that this 10-year-old girl, a princess, a king's daughter, was standing in a cold room being handed off like a parcel by the very people who'd ruined her, with not one single person in the whole vast capital who was on her side. Not one. Being cast out alone into strangers, hated, useful to everyone as a leash and loved by no one at all. And I knew that shape. I knew it from the inside. I died of that shape, alone in a parking lot, hard and useful and unloved, reaching for a number I never dialed. Renji was murmuring the strategy we accept. We house her. We manage the leash. We turn Keige's spy into our own channel. We, the correct play. The play I'd have made in my sleep. Accept the hostage, control the hostage, turn her presence to advantage. I didn't make that play. I stepped forward, small in the marble room, and everyone looked at me because an 8-year-old peasant stepping forward at court is not done, and I said, clearly to the officials, to Keige's people, to the whole cold hall, We'll take her, gladly, but not as a punishment. I looked at the furious dry-eyed girl. If she comes to us, she comes as family, not a prisoner, not a project to be reformed, a member of my father's house, with a place at our fire, same as anyone. I turned to the officials. That's the only way we'll have her, as kin or not at all. The room went strange and quiet. Goro was staring at me. Sai's hand had gone still on my shoulder. Renji's careful court face had cracked open because I'd just thrown out his whole clean strategy. I hadn't turned the leash into armor. I hadn't managed the hostage. I'd stood up in front of the crown and asked of my own free will to love the weapon they were pointing at my family. And Hinano the princess looked at me for the first time. Really looked. The contempt flickered, because she'd braced her whole self for a household that would resent her, punish her, use her, feed her scraps, and remind her hourly of her fall. That was the humiliation Kage had designed, and she was armored for exactly it. And instead, a strange peasant boy had stood up in front of the entire court and said she comes as family, or not at all. And she had absolutely no armor for that. And for one unguarded second, I saw behind the fury a terrified, lonely child who had never once in her life been offered a place at a fire that wasn't a transaction. Then she remembered herself and sneered and said something cutting, and the moment closed. But I'd seen it. And I'd decided Kage's people did not like it. I watched them not like it, watched a smooth minister in fine cloth register that the peasant boy had just done something that broke the design, because a princess punished into a resentful household is a leash. But a princess welcomed into a loving one is a girl who might, given time, start to love the household back and stop being Kage's piece at all. I'd taken his hostage and quietly declared I intended to free her in the only way that mattered. And he could hear it, and he did not like it, but he couldn't stop it. Not without revealing that the honor had always been a leash and Kage was too careful for that. In open court with Renji watching and Ishibe's loyal reputation freshly polished, so it was agreed. Princess Hinano, stripped of her title, was remanded to the household of Goro, headman of Ishibe, for re-education and the crown's convenience. Kage's people would visit, Kage's eyes would watch, and Kage would wait, I understood, for the girl to make Ishibe miserable, for the arrangement to sour, for any excuse to say see. The peasants cannot manage her, give her back to us and get his leash back. I understood all of it, and I found I didn't care about the strategy anymore. Or rather, I'd made my strategy, and it was the strangest one of my two lives. And it was this. I'm going to make a lonely, hateful, ruined child into my sister. And if I do that, Kage's leash turns to smoke in his hand, because you cannot hold a girl who has somewhere she'd rather be. Renji on the road home said it plainly, half admiring, half worried. You could have played that a dozen ways to advantage. You chose the one with the least advantage and the most risk. You chose to pity her. He looked at me. That's not like you, strategist. Or no, I think it's exactly like you, and you hide it under the strategy. I think everything you build so you can afford to be soft. The wealth, the armor, the king in your pocket. It's all so that when a lonely child stands in front of you, you can afford to just take her in. He wasn't wrong. He was the second person after Sei to see the thing under the thing. Everything I build is the same want. I'd told him once, I just want everyone home. Hinano had no home. So, she arrived in Ishibe a week after us, delivered by Kage's minders with a wagon of fine possessions she wouldn't need, and an attitude that could strip paint. She was, that first month, everything the court had promised, and worse. She refused to do a single thing. She would not fetch water. I am a daughter of the king. I do not carry water. She would not help with the fish or the mill or any of the work that every hand in Ishibe did as a matter of survival. She insulted the food, insulted the house, insulted Sai's cooking to Sai's face, called Goro a mud farmer, called the village a pigsty, called me with a special, searching cruelty, having already sensed I was the one who saw her a freak, a curse, a peasant who thought he was clever. She had Kage's cruelties memorized, and she deployed them like a soldier who's only got the one weapon and means to use it till it breaks. Goro's patience frayed within days. He'd taken her in on my word, and his instinct, a fair one, was that you did not let a guest, princess or not, spit on your wife's cooking and call your village a pigsty. Sei stopped him, every time with a hand on his arm, and a look I recognized, because it was the same still, sharp, I'm watching and understanding look she'd turned on me over the stone tower. Only now she was turning it on Hinano, and I knew my mother had read the girl the same way I had. There was a frightened child under the fury. Sai had lost her own parents to distance once. She knew what it was to be a girl cast far from home. She met every insult with warmth, unbudgeable, maddening warmth. The warmth she'd wrapped me in by the coals, and it visibly unsettled Hinano more than any punishment could have, because you cannot fight warmth with insults. The insults just sink into it and vanish. And I did what I do. I engineered. Not the leash, I let the leash be. Let Kage's minders come and watch and report there. The peasants cannot manage her reports. Because I knew something Kage didn't, which was that the reports would stop being true. So I engineered belonging in the same patient laundered way I'd once engineered a fish trap through Uncle Taku in pieces. Through play, never forcing, letting each small thing be her own idea. She wouldn't work? Fine, I didn't ask her to. I just made sure she was bored. Profoundly bored. A court girl used to endless intrigue and spectacle, now marooned in a valley with nothing to do, because she refused to do anything. And then I made the things everyone else did look interesting. I let Yuna and Kohana read in front of her, showing off, competing, and I watched a girl who'd been raised to believe peasants were animals, slowly, secretly, register that these mud village children could do a thing she couldn't read their own sound letters. And I watched the vanity in her, which was enormous, curdle into something useful. She could not stand that two peasant girls could do something she couldn't. It was the same lever that had taught Yuna to read out of spite. I let it sit and work. I let her watch the mill. The trip hammers falling, the water doing the work, the whole strange machine of it, and I saw, one evening, when she thought no one watched, the princess standing alone at the creek bank, staring at the wheel turn, and there was no contempt on her face at all, only a child's raw wonder at a thing she'd never imagined. The same wonder the village women had cried over. She didn't know how to be curious out loud yet, without losing face, but she was curious. I filed it, and I was patient with her, relentlessly. The way you're patient with a load-bearing member you can't afford to crack, because I knew from the inside the exact shape of what she was, a hard shell built over a terrified want to be wanted, and I knew there was no forcing that shell. You could only make the inside safe enough that the shell became unnecessary, and wait, and wait, and wait. The way I'd waited a whole summer for a fish weir, the way I'd waited 6 years to be known. It became, that autumn, the strange center of everything in our house, the clash of a vain, wounded, ruined princess against Sai's immovable warmth, and my engineer's patience, and the sheer baffling kindness of a village that would not hate her back no matter how hard she tried to earn it. And it was the story's real work now more than any cart or king. Because Kaig was watching, and waiting for the arrangement to sour, for his excuse to reclaim his peace, and I intended quietly, patiently in pieces to make sure the girl he'd sent us as a weapon became, before he understood what was happening, my sister and no longer his to take. A princess broke, not with a fight, but with a rice mill, and I wasn't even there to see the first crack. It happened over the winter, slow, the way I'd built everything slow. Hinano stopped insulting the food first, not by praising it, she'd never have allowed herself that, but by simply eating it in silence, which for her was a surrender. Then the water. Sei had never once ordered her to fetch it. Sei had just kept fetching it herself, day after day, an aging woman hauling buckets in the cold, while a healthy 10-year-old sat idle, until one morning, the shame of it, the plain human shame of watching someone work for you and giving nothing got heavier than the pride, and Hinano picked up a bucket, said nothing, fetched water, dared anyone to remark on it. No one did. That was the deal. Sai's warmth offered. You can join us any time and we will never ever make you pay for having refused. The mill got her fully. It was Yuna who did it, in the end, not me. And that mattered, that it wasn't me, because I'd learned that the strongest structures are the ones that hold themselves up without the engineer standing under them. Yuna, loud and fearless and utterly unimpressed by royalty, had decided somewhere along the line that Hinano was not a princess, but a rival, one more person circling near Haru's workshop, who needed putting in her place, and Yuna's way of putting people in their place was to be better than them at something and rub their nose in it. So Yuna, running the mill one morning, adjusting the flow to the trip hammers with the offhand competence of a girl who'd grown up in it, caught Hinano watching from the bank with that hungry hidden curiosity, and said sharp, mocking, "What, princess? You don't even know how it works? A baby could work it." And Hinano, who could not bear to be beaten at anything by a peasant, came down off the bank to prove she could. That was all it took. That was the whole lever. Yuna's spite and Hinano's pride, and by noon the princess had her sleeves pushed up, and her hands on the sluice gate, learning the rhythm of the water, and the fall of the hammers, furious and focused, determined to master it purely to wipe the smirk off Yuna's face, and somewhere in the middle of it, without noticing, she started to enjoy it. The wheel turning, the grain going in rough and coming out fine. The plain satisfaction of a thing done with your own hands that stays done. She'd spent 10 years in a world where nothing she did was real, where every act was a move in someone else's game, and here was a machine that didn't care she was a princess, that only cared whether she read the water right and gave her honest bread for honest attention. She'd never had honest anything. She learned the mill. Then, because Yuna could read and she couldn't, and that was intolerable, she took up the tablets sitting down beside Yuna and Kohana, like any village child, a fallen princess spelling her sounds in the dirt, driven by pure competitive spite that curdled exactly as I'd known it would, into genuine skill and then into something she'd never expected, friendship. Because you cannot sit beside two girls every day, losing to them and beating them and laughing at the losing, without the losing and the winning becoming a thing you share. Yuna, who'd started as her rival, became her closest ally in the village, the two fierce ones recognizing each other. Kohana taught her patience. The three of them, loud and quiet and royal, became a knot. And I watched the shell I'd been so patient with become, day by day, unnecessary, and then, one evening, come off entirely. She came to me by the coals. It was late. The house was mostly asleep. I was resting the way Sae made me rest, and Hinano sat down across from me. And for a long time she didn't say anything, just stared at the fire, and I let her, because I'd learned that some structures you have to let settle on their own. Then she said, quietly, without the armor, in a voice I'd never heard from her, "I was awful to you, all of you. I called your mother's cooking slop to her face. I called your father a mud farmer. I called you a curse," she swallowed, "and your mother handed me a bucket and taught me to fetch water like I'd asked nicely. And your father, I called him a mud farmer to his face, and he still fixed the door of my room when it stuck without me asking. And you, She looked at me. You stood up in front of the whole court, a peasant, 7 years old, and you said I could come as family or not at all, when everyone I'd known my whole life had just thrown me away like a broken cup. Her eyes were wet, and she let them be, finally, in front of someone. Why? You didn't know me. I was nothing to you. I was Kaga's leash on your village. You must have known that. You're the cleverest person I've ever met. Of course you knew. Why would you take a leash into your own house on purpose and offer it a place at your fire? I looked at the girl across the coals and I thought about a parking lot and a phone and a number I never dialed and a whole life spent hard and useful and unloved because I was too afraid of the answer to ever ask the question. Because I know what you are, I said. You made yourself hard so no one could see there was nothing holding you up. You made yourself useful and cruel and clever so no one would notice that not one single person in the whole world was on your side. I know that because I nearly told her the true truth. Right there, the parking lot. And I didn't. But I told her the shape of it because I knew someone once who did exactly that. Built a wall of usefulness so high that when he died, there was no one on the other side of it. And I swore I'd never let that happen to anyone I could reach. I met her eyes. You were someone I could reach. That's all. That's the whole reason. You were a lonely person I could reach, so I reached. Hinano cried then, properly, the way she'd never let the court see, and I let her. And when she was done, she scrubbed her face and looked at me with something fierce and new. And she said, then I'm yours. Do you understand? Not Kagi's, not the crown's, yours. This family's, and I've spent my whole life learning how these people play their games. The court, the ministers, all of it. I know every move Kagi will make before he makes it, because they taught me to make them. She set her jaw. I'm done being his piece. I'm going to be your sister, and I'm going to be useful the way you're useful, not because I have to, but because I finally have someone worth being useful for. I'd taken in a weapon and it had turned in my hand into a shield. Kag did not intend to lose his peace quietly. He'd been watching all along, his minders coming and going, and the reports he wanted the peasants cannot manage her. The arrangement sours give her back had stopped coming, because they'd stopped being true. So Kag moved, the way careful ambitious men move. He reached to reclaim her directly. He sent word to the crown that the princess's re-education was complete enough that she should be brought back under proper supervision, meaning his before her exile made her in the court's eyes permanently déclassée and useless as a piece. He dressed it, of course, as Mercy, the poor fallen princess, redeemed, ready to be restored. He would take her back to the capital, restore a shadow of her standing, and hold her leash himself, this time with no inconvenient loving household in the way. We were summoned to court over it, the whole question of the princess's disposition to be settled before the king. And this is where Hinano, whom I'd spent a winter making into my sister, made herself into the sharpest instrument in my whole arsenal, and did it entirely on her own. I'd have played it my way, humble, indirect. The caravan of gifts approach, making Kaga's reclamation look grasping while we looked selfless. It would have worked, probably. But Hinano stopped me, in the antechamber before the audience, and said low and fierce, "No, this one's mine. I know exactly how to break him, because he taught me how, and he'll never see it coming from me, because he still thinks I'm his." Her eyes glittered. Let me. I've never once in my life gotten to use what they taught me for something I actually wanted. Let me use it for you. I let her. She walked into the audience hall a fallen princess, and she walked out having wrecked a premiere. And she did it with pure court craft. The very skill Kagi's own people had drilled into her, turned against the man who drilled it. Kag made his case to the king. The princess redeemed, ready for restoration. Best returned to proper care in the capital. All mercy. All reason. And then Hinano was permitted to speak, and Kagig everyone expected a broken exile, grateful to be rescued from the mud. Instead, she was luminous, poised, perfectly, devastatingly polite. And she thanked Minister Kagi warmly, publicly, for his tireless concern for her well-being. Such concern. She said, so much concern, from the very moment her troubles began. And then, with the delicate, lethal precision of someone raised in that hall, she began to lay out, as gratitude, as innocent reminiscence, the exact sequence of Kage's care, how the minister's own attendants had been so close to her before her scandal, how the indiscretion that ruined her had grown from occasions Kage's people arranged, how at every step of her fall, the hands guiding her toward it, and the hands offering to catch her afterward, had belonged to the same faction. How curious, she mused sweetly, that the man who benefited most from her being a fallen piece should be so very eager, now, to pick that piece back up. She never once accused him. She only remembered in loving detail in front of the king, a chain of small true facts that Kagate had counted on no one ever assembling, least of all the pliable girl he'd assembled them around. And the king, who was not a fool, assembled them. I watched Kaga's face across that hall, and I watched a careful, ambitious man realize too late that the piece he'd manufactured and cast out and reached to reclaim had spent a winter in a peasant household learning to be free, and had just smiling in perfect courtly language, exposed the whole machine of her own ruin to the one person Kage could not afford to have see it. He couldn't refute her. Every fact was true. He'd made them true himself. He could only stand there while the king's face went cold, watching his own daughter reveal, with terrible grace, exactly what his minister had done to her and why. The face slap landed like nothing before it. Not a merchant humiliated, not a regional lord rebuked, a premier of the realm, exposed by his own weapon, his manipulation of a royal child laid bare before the throne, his standing at court cracked clean through, his faction reeling, his whole careful scheme to hold Ishibi by the collar, collapsed because the collar had learned to speak. And the king, moved by a daughter he'd thrown away who now stood before him whole and dignified and free, restored her title on probation. Provisionally, the court's caution winning out over the moment, but restored it. Princess Hinano again. And when it was done before the whole hall, she was asked where she wished to reside now that she was restored. Expecting she'd choose the palace her rightful place, she said, She said she wished to remain most of the year, with the family that had taken her in as kin. When the crown had cast her out to serve, she said, as a bridge between the capital and the loyal, blessed, prosperous district that had done the crown such honor in raising her right. Which meant she was still ours, restored, powerful, favored, and still ours. And now Kage's leash was not just broken, it was hanging around his neck, because a restored princess who publicly loved Ishibi and distrusted Kage was worth more to us than any hostage had ever been worth to him. I'd taken in his weapon and it had turned, and now it was pointed at him. We rode home in triumph, Hinano genuinely one of us now, Yuna and Tohana thrilled to have their fierce friend back, Sei quietly weeping in the cart because the ruined girl she'd fed and clothed and refused to hate had stood before a king and chosen home. And I let myself have the win. Kage finished as a threat. Hinano safe. The family grown by one more. The way I'd sworn everything I built was for. But Renji riding beside us was not celebrating. He'd been quiet the whole journey. And near the end of it he pulled his horse close to our cart and said low so Saie and Hinano wouldn't hear. There's news from the eastern border. It came while we were at court, and I didn't want to spoil the girl's victory. His face was grim in a way I'd not seen from him. The neighboring principality Lord Domio's country, across the river, that marks the district's eastern edge, he's massing men, making noise about the riverlands. There's an old dispute over the floodplain whose it is. The rivers shifted over the years, and both sides claimed the low ground it left. He met my eyes. Domio's decided to settle it. He's going to march. And the richest, fattest, most tempting thing on his side of that river is us, I said. Is you, Renji said. He's heard the same stories the whole world's heard. A rich, soft farming village, grown fat on carts and mills. No real army but my garrison company, which is enough to keep bandits off and regional lords honest. And nothing at all against a principality's host. He shook his head. He thinks you're a peach on a low branch. Haru, softest, richest thing on the border. He thinks he'll march in, take the riverlands and Ishibi with them, and be home by harvest. And by every ordinary measure of soldiers and swords. He was quiet a moment. He's right. Goro's garrison can't stop a principality in the field. I sat in the springed cart 7 years old, and I did not feel the cold fear I'd have felt 2 years ago, because I'd stopped, somewhere along the way, thinking about problems in terms of swords. Domio thought in soldiers, in fields, in the ordinary arithmetic of who has more men. And the ordinary arithmetic said he'd win. But I didn't fight with soldiers. I never had. I'd fished with water and traveled on springs and warmed a village with cooked wood and turned a king into armor and a hostage into a sister. I fought with the world itself with gravity and current and weather and the plain machinery of how things worked. And Renji had just told me the 2 words that changed everything. And he didn't even know he'd handed me the whole answer. Riverlands, I said slowly, mostly to myself. Floodplain. The low ground the river left when it shifted. I looked up at Renji. Tell me about the river. The dam upstream if there is one. Everything. Every rise and channel between us and Lord Domio's country. Renji looked at me and slowly, the grimness on his face changed into something else. The look of a man who just remembered that the boy beside him didn't answer knives by defending. You're not going to fight him, he said. No, I said, watching the eastern hills, already seeing the water in my mind, the whole floodplain, the sluices, the ground that was low for a reason. I'm going to let the river fight him. I just have to build the wall first. And the wall is going to be water. Lord Domio was marching an army to take a peach off a low branch, and I was going to hand him a swamp instead. The river was the whole answer, and I spent the days before his host arrived learning it the way I'd once learned the creek, walking it, measuring it, reading the ground with a 52-year-old's eye for how water actually behaves. And what I found was a gift Domio didn't know he was walking into. The river marked the district's eastern edge, and it had shifted over generations, the way rivers do, carving a new channel and leaving its old bed as a broad, flat, low floodplain. The disputed riverlands both sides claimed. That floodplain was the only good ground for an army to cross on. Everywhere else the banks rose into hills and forest, bad country for wagons and cavalry. But the old floodplain ran flat and open and dry, straight toward Ishibi, a natural highway which was exactly why Domio would use it, why any commander would use it, why it was the obvious approach that made him think we were soft. The one flat road to our door. It was flat because the river used to be there. It was dry because the river had moved. And it was lower than the current riverbed, held back only by the natural bank the river had built when it shifted, and by an old earthwork weir upstream that the district had maintained for generations to keep the spring melt from reclaiming its old bed and drowning the good paddies below. That old weir was the wall it was already built. It had been built for 100 years for an entirely different reason. and it happened to sit exactly where I needed it, a barrier holding a great mass of the river's flow up in its current channel, above a floodplain that wanted to be underwater and was only dry because we kept it dry. All I had to do was decide when to stop keeping it dry. I laid it out for them by the coals Gorosei Renji and now Hinano, who sat at the fire as family, and I was learning as a mind worth having at any council. And I laid it out, not as a battle plan, but as an engineering plan, because that was the only kind of plan that could win. Goro can't beat Domyo's army, I said. Renji's told us that plainly and he's right. If this comes down to soldiers in a field, we lose, and the village burns, and everything we built dies in an afternoon. I let that sit. So we don't let it come down to soldiers in a field. We take the field itself away from him. We drown it. I walk them through the river. The old weir upstream, holding the flow. The floodplain below, dry only because we kept it so. Domyo's certain approach along that flat open ground, because it was the only road wide enough for his wagons and horse. And the plan, reinforce the old weir not to hold water back forever, but to hold more of it, and to hold it behind gates we control. Cut controllable sluices into the earthwork, timber gates we could raise and drop on command, so that instead of a dumb barrier we had a valve, a trigger. We spend the days before Domyo comes quietly building up the head of water behind that weir, penning the river higher than it's ever run, and we wait. And when his army is out on the floodplain, I said, strung out along that flat road, wagons and cavalry deep in the low ground, committed no way to turn a whole host around fast. I opened my hand. We open the gates, all of them, and the river we've been penning up remembers where it used to live. It comes down into its old bed being the floodplain his entire army is standing on. Silence around the coals. You drown them, Goro said, low. No, I said, and this was the part that mattered most to me, the part that made it my victory, and not a butcher's. That's the whole point, Papa. I don't want to drown them. A floodplain doesn't drown an army, it bogs it. The water spreads wide and shallow and turns hard flat ground into a swamp. The wagons sink to the axles. The horses can't charge through mud to their knees. Cavalry is useless in a bog, worse than useless. It panics. The men aren't killed. They're stuck. Cold, wet, mired. Their supply wagons sunk. Their charge broken. Their whole momentum swallowed by ground that turned to soup under them. I looked at each of them. An army that can't move isn't an army. It's 10,000 miserable men standing in mud a long way from home, watching their food sink, wondering why they came. And a commander looking at that doesn't order a doomed charge through a swamp. He does the sensible thing. He talks. You want to defeat a principality, Renji said slowly, without killing anyone. I want to defeat a principality, I said, by making the fight so obviously lost that no one has to die to prove it. Domyo came for an easy conquest. We make the conquest impossible and cheap to abandon, and we give him a way to walk home that doesn't cost him his whole army. A man who can retreat without slaughter, retreats. It's the men with nothing to lose who fight to the death. We make sure he has everything to lose and an open door behind him. I paused. And no dead peasants. No burned village. No sons of Ishibi in the ground. We win the way we've won everything, by making the world itself do the work, so we don't have to. Goro looked at me for a long moment across the fire. And then he did the thing he did now. The thing that told me the frightened man from the coal's confession was gone forever. He nodded, once, and said, tell me what to build. We built it in the days we had, and it was the biggest thing I'd ever made, and I made it. Still in pieces, with Sei watching my face for the gray, because dying of my own cleverness now, on the edge of this, would have been the stupidest possible end. Once, driving the whole plan through my head at the weir's edge while men hauled stone around me, I felt the old fizz come up at the corners of my sight, the gray creeping in, and Sei was at my elbow before I swayed, sitting me down hard against a timber, holding my head until it passed the old enemy, never quite gone, waiting for the day I forgot it. Taku ran the weir work, cursing at a scale I'd never heard, reinforcing the old earthwork with timber and stone, and cutting the controllable sluices. 3 great timber gates in the barrier, each on a lifting frame we could drop or raise with levers, because I'd designed them like the mill's sluice gates scaled up enormous. The same principle Hinano had learned to work with her own hands. Every hand in the village worked it, and the neighbors who'd migrated in over the fat years worked it, and Renji's garrison soldiers worked it, hauling stone, driving timber, penning the river higher day by day behind the growing wall while the water rose and pressed and waited. I ran the supply, because I'd added the second half of the plan, the half that turned a defense into a whole system, the springed carts. We had a fleet of them now, the village's pride, and I converted them some to rapid supply wagons that could move food and timber and men over rough ground faster than any ordinary cart, floating over the ruts that would mire a normal wheel, and some, crucially, to medic transports, padded, smooth riding, so that if anyone on our side was hurt in the chaos, they could be carried out fast and gently. I organized the whole logistics of it, my manager, running the operation while I rested. And Sai watched me rest. And I looked at the girl who'd once learned her letters faster than any of us, now marshalling a fleet of carts and a district's worth of supplies, and I thought, this is what I built. Not machines. People who can run machines without me standing under them. And AI ran the last quietest piece of it too. The day before Domyo's host was due, she led the women, the old and the children up onto the high ground behind the village and settled them there, out of the low country entirely, with the garrison holding the approaches below so that if the gates failed, if the water came slow or the plan cracked, there would be no one to drown but soldiers who'd chosen to march. I would not gamble a single child of Ishibi on my own arithmetic. Whatever happened at the weir, the people were already safe on the hill. Yuna and Kohanna ran the gates. My first two students, the loud one and the quiet one, I put them on the sluice levers because they knew the mill's waterwork better than anyone but me, and because I trusted Yuna's nerve and Kohanna's precision to open the gates at exactly the right moment and not a heartbeat early. Their grandfathers, Tetsu and Iwa, watched their granddaughters given the most important task in the whole defense, and forgot for once to squabble over which should marry me, too busy being terrified and proud. And Hinano ran the thing I couldn't. The words, because a plan that ends in a bogged army only works if someone can turn a bogged army into a retreating one, and that took courtcraft. Parley, the delicate lethal diplomacy that had wrecked Kage and I had, sitting at my fire, a restored princess who could do it. When the floodplain's a swamp and Domyo's stuck, I told her, someone has to ride out under Parley and give him the door home. Someone he can't dismiss as a peasant. Someone with the standing to speak for a district and the skill to make surrender look like his own wise choice. She'd looked at me and grinned, fierce and glad, and said, "You built a whole flood so that at the end of it I get to talk. You clever thing. You always leave the last move for the person who most needs to make it." Domyo came, and he came exactly as I'd read him. His host appeared on the eastern hills and poured down as any commander would onto the one flat open road toward Ishibi, the floodplain, the old riverbed, the low dry ground that was the obvious highway to a soft rich prize. Thousands of men, wagons of supply, ranks of cavalry, all of it committing itself onto that flat. All of it certain. All of it strung out along the low ground and pushing deeper toward the village, because Domyo could see Ishibi now, could see it was undefended by any real army, could taste the easy conquest he'd marched for. We let him come. That was the hardest part. Goro's whole soul strained to do something as an army marched on his village, and I held him, held all of them. Wait, let him commit. Let the whole host get out onto the low ground. Let the wagons and the horse get deep. Wait, while the river pressed against the gates upstream, penned higher than it had ever run, straining to remember its old home. Domyo's vanguard was perhaps a mile from the village. His whole army was out on the floodplain, deep, committed, the wagons in the middle, the cavalry spread. No way to reverse a host that size in any hurry. I gave the signal, a flag up the valley relayed to the weir. Yuna and Kohanna threw the levers, and the three great sluice gates dropped their frames and the penned river went home. It didn't come as a killing wall. I'd built it exactly so it wouldn't. It came as a spreading flood, wide and slow and relentless, the river pouring down into its old bed the way water always finds its old bed, and it went first, as water does, into the lowest ground, the middle and the rear of the floodplain, where the wagons stood and the supply was massed and the road ran back toward the dry hills Domyo's host had come down from. It didn't swallow the whole army in an hour. It didn't have to. It filled the low center and it cut the road behind them, turning 100 years of packed dry ground back into the swamp it had always secretly been. And it did it exactly where it hurt most. The supply drowned. The line of retreat vanished under spreading water, and Domyo's vanguard out ahead near the village found itself trapped on shrinking dry ground between a rising swamp and a village they now had no way to reach, cut off from their own rear, their road home underwater, their army split and mired behind them. The wagons in the center went first, sinking to the axles, then the beds, the supply of a whole host mired and lost. The cavalry, which is nothing but a fast, heavy thing that needs firm ground, found itself in mud to the horses, knees and then their bellies, and horses in a bog do not charge. They panic and flounder and throw their riders. The ranks of men who'd marched dry and confident found themselves standing in cold spreading water that rose to their calves, their thighs, their supply gone, their horses useless, their road back to the dry hills swallowed, and the rich, soft village they'd come to take sitting untouched and dry on the high ground beyond the water, defended by a river. And Lord Domyo, from his horse on a rise of higher ground, looked out over his split and drowning army, and his sunk supplies and the impossible undamaged village beyond, and did what I'd built the whole flood to make him do. He didn't order a doomed charge through the swamp toward the village, and he couldn't simply march his host back the way it came, because the way it came was underwater. He was pinned between a village he couldn't reach, and a retreat he couldn't take. He stopped. He looked for someone to talk to. Hinano rode out to him under parley, and I could not hear the words from where I stood on the dry high ground with my family, but I could read the shape of it, and Renji told me the rest after. She rode out a princess of the crown, restored, favored, unmistakable into the middle of a bogged invasion, and she gave Lord Domyo exactly the thing I designed for her to give. A way home that didn't cost him everything. She was gracious. She was devastating. She pointed out courteously that his army was destroyed without a single blow struck, that the district could keep the water rising or let it drain at its leisure, and that his mired men would starve or drown or surrender at whatever pace the district chose. She pointed out that he had marched on a village under the crown's protection, garrisoned by a royal cousin, blessed by the shrine, that this was not a peach on a low branch, but the personal, favored, defended domain of the king himself, and that the king would hear, in full, how Lord Domio's host had been swallowed by a swamp without harming one loyal subject. And then she gave him the door. "Withdraw now," she offered, and the district would let the water drain and let his mired men and horses walk out of the swamp alive, rather than leave them to rot in it. Renounce the claim on the riverlands, which had, after all, just proven themselves worthless as a road and lethal as a battlefield, and go home with an army instead of a graveyard. Refuse, and stay in the swamp and explain to his own people why he'd drowned a principality's host for a peach that turned out to be a fortress made of water. Domio took the door. Of course he took the door. A commander who can retreat without slaughter retreats, and I'd made sure he could. Once the water was let down and the road drained, he pulled his mired, humiliated, exhausted host back across the river, renounced the riverlands, and marched home having lost his supply, his pride, his claim, and a hard lesson about what the rich, soft village on the border actually was, and not one man of Ishibi in the ground, and not one house burned, and, in the end, not even a real slaughter of his own men. The final antagonist, defeated by water and words, face-slapped by a river and a girl he'd never have deigned to notice. The district's dominance was total now, and everyone from the capital to the border knew it. Unbeatable defense, a domain that could turn its own ground into a weapon and drown an army without loss. Unmatched wealth. The crown's favor, a garrison, a princess, the shrine's blessing. Ishibi was no longer a peach on any branch. It was the strongest, richest, most untouchable place in the whole region, and its word my word, though I never spoke it as mine now shaped the district and reached, through Renji and Hinano and a grateful king, into the court itself. I stood on the dry high ground with my family, and watched a principality's army walk backward out of a swamp, and Goro put his enormous hand on my head, and Sai leaned against him with her parents beside her, and Hinano rode back to us glowing with a victory that was hers as much as mine, and Yuna and Kohana whooped at the gates and Uncle Taku wept over his weir, and I understood that the man who died alone in the snow reaching for a number he never dialed had in his second life just built a domain that a king's rival couldn't take, and had done it without a single one of his people dying for it. The weather that had dwarfed me my whole first life, and half my second, the famine, the crown, the lords, the armies, I stood taller than all of it now, 9 years old, on the high ground above a river that had fought my war for me. There was only one thing left to do, and it wasn't a battle. It was going home and finding out what a king does when a boy drowns an army with a river. A king wanted to make a 10-year-old the royal mechanic, and the 10-year-old's only real condition was that it changed nothing about who actually ran his village, because that was the shape of it. When the crown's answer to Domio's drowned army came up the mountain road, word had reached the capital in full how a rich, soft border village had turned its own river into a wall and swallowed a principality's invasion without losing a house or a life, how the loyal, blessed garrison district of Ishibi had defended the crown's eastern edge more completely than any army the crown could have sent, and a king who nearly lost a stretch of border to Lord Domio and instead got it defended for free by a district that asked for nothing, does not forget that. A king rewards it, lavishly, publicly, so that every other border lord understands exactly which side of that river they'd rather be on. Renji brought the honors himself, the way he'd brought the first ones. 4 years ago now, I was 10. And the boy who'd sat in the dust while a merchant called him a pig had somehow become the person a king sent his cousin across the plain to honor. The first honor went to Goro, and it was the one I'd wanted most. And it was right. The king named Goro governor of the district, not just headman of one village anymore, governor. The crown's own official authority over the whole district of which Ishibi was now unmistakably the heart. My gruff, frightened mountain of a father, who years ago had wanted to pull the fish weirs and go poor again to stay invisible, who had relived his dead brother in every feint I'd suffered, that man stood in his own yard and received the governorship of his district from a king's cousin, and his back was straight, and his face was not afraid, and I watched Sai watch him, and I understood that this was a thing I'd built as surely as any mill, not just a rich village, but a father who'd grown large enough to fill it. From a man who forbade his strange son's genius out of terror, to a governor who trusted it and stood beside it. That was the finest structure I ever raised, next to a family put back together in a road. The second honor was mine, and I did not want it, and I nearly refused it, and the refusing became the last important thing I built. The king, Renji announced, with a court formality that had a glint of private amusement under it, in recognition of the marvels of Ishibi, the carts, the mills, the defense of the eastern border confers upon Haru, son of Governor Goro, the honorary title of Royal Mechanic of the realm. Royal Mechanic. A 10-year-old given a title of the court, named across the whole kingdom as the mind behind the marvels. Everyone in the yard was delighted. Goro's chest could not have gotten prouder. Yuna whooped. Hinano restored. Favored. A bridge to the court now in truth clapped like it was the finest news in the world. And I stood there and felt something I hadn't expected, which was fear. The old cold correct fear of the strategist. Because a title is not a gift. A title is a hook. Name a boy Royal Mechanic and you've made him the crowns, you've put a claim on him, drawn him toward the capital, made his marvels a resource of the throne, rather than of his own village. It was Kage's leash logic in a kinder costume. Honor the useful thing so completely that it belongs to you. And it was exactly the trap I'd have set if I were the crown, to bring a dangerously clever border boy under the court's hand, where he could be watched and used, and eventually controlled. I saw it in the space of a breath, and I saw just as fast that I couldn't simply refuse it. Refusing a king's honor is spitting on the king. The same lesson from the very first garrison, and I hadn't spent 4 years making the crown into armor just to crack it now over pride. So I did what I'd learned to do. I accepted, and I made the accepting into my own move. I bowed properly. Hinano had drilled me in it on the ride home, half laughing. You drowned an army, but you bow like a plow ox. Let me show you, and I thank the king. Through Renji, with the humble gratitude I'd made Ishibe famous for. And then I added my condition, and I dressed it as more humility, because the deepest cut always comes wrapped as a courtesy. I accept the honor gladly, I said, and unworthily a boy could not deserve it. But I would beg the king's understanding on one point, out of loyalty to him. I let that land loyalty to him, not to me. The marvels of Ishibe were never made by one hand. The carts were built by Uncle Taku. The mill runs by AI's ordering and Yuna's and Kohana's hands. The defense was Governor Goro's command and Renji's soldiers and Princess Hinano's diplomacy, and every villager who hauled a stone. If a royal mechanic is to serve the crown, he serves it best rooted here, among the people who actually build the marvels not summoned to the capital, where there are no weirs to fish, and no rivers to raise, and no children to teach, and where he'd become one clever man in a hall, instead of one clever man in a workshop full of hands that make his ideas real. I looked at Renji, and passed him at the crown he spoke for. Let the title be true, I said, and let the governance stay here with the village council, with my father, with the people who live it. I'll serve the crown as royal mechanic from Ishibe, building marvels the whole realm can use, and I'll serve it far better rooted than transplanted. A tree gives more fruit in its own soil. It was, of course, a negotiation, and everyone clever in that yard knew it. Renji's mouth twitched, Hinano's eyes danced. I was accepting the crown's hook, and quietly, courteously, pulling it out of my own mouth in the same breath. Taking the honor while refusing the leash, becoming the royal mechanic of Ishibe rather than the royal mechanic at the palace. The marvels flowing outward to the realm from a district that stayed always its own. The crown got a famous servant and a defended border and the marvels of the age. I kept the one thing that mattered, home, and the fact that real power over Ishibe would never leave the hands of the people who lived in it. Renji carried the condition back to the king, and the king who was no fool, and who had just watched this same boy drown a principality by understanding exactly how the world worked, and who preferred a loyal border defended for free over a resentful genius caged in his court, accepted it. Royal mechanic of Ishibe. The title true, the governance local. The leash refused so gracefully it looked like devotion. Kage was finished, his faction wrecked over Hinano. His schemes against Ishibe collapsed, no longer a threat to anyone. Saburo was finished, humiliated years back, and never recovered. Domyo was neutralized across his river. An army walked home in shame. Every knife that had been aimed at my family over 4 years lay broken, and I had never once picked up a sword. I'd answered every one of them the way Renji said I did. I'd never defended. I'd only ever made the knife point back. The grandfather's war ended that same season, and it ended in laughter, which was the only fitting end for a war that stupid and that fond. Tetsu and Iwa had never given up. Years of it, Yuna's grandfather and Kohana's grandfather, each still convinced that binding his granddaughter to the now famous royal mechanic would settle their lifelong rivalry forever in his line's favor. Both of them insufferable. Both of them treating my marriage prospects as unfinished business. And now that I was titled, now that Ishibe was the heart of a governed district, the pressure had gotten worse, not better, because now it wasn't just a clever boy they wanted to bind. It was a royal mechanic. Yuna and Kohana solved it themselves, and they solved it in the way I'd secretly hoped for since I'd first marked the loud one and the quiet one as the two best hands in my workshop. They'd started as rivals over the tablets, over the ground beside me, over the whole silly years their grandfathers had inflamed. But you cannot spend years learning together, working the mill together, throwing the sluice levers that drowned an army together, without the rivalry wearing down into something better. Yuna's fearless speed and Kohana's careful precision had stopped being a competition and become a partnership. The two of them were genuinely the finest pair of craft hands in the district, and they knew it, and they'd figured out, long before their grandfathers, that they were worth infinitely more as partners than as rivals. So when the grandfathers, emboldened by my new title, pushed for a decision the boy must choose, Yuna or Kohana, the two girls stood up together, side by side, and refused the whole premise, laughing, in front of both furious old men. They didn't want to be chosen. They didn't want a betrothal that made one of them the winner and one the loser, and both of them prizes. What they wanted, what they announced to the grandfather's spluttering horror, was to be my partners. Not in marriage, in the work. The first two partners of the workshop and the school I was about to build, co-teachers, co-makers, the royal mechanic's own right and left hands, equal, both, forever. Tetsu and Iwa were comically, completely defeated, outmaneuvered, not by me but by their own granddaughters, who'd looked at a rivalry two old men had spent their whole lives feeding, and simply declined to inherit it. And the funniest part, the part that made even the grandfathers eventually laugh, was that the girls had won something bigger than any betrothal. They'd made themselves partners of the most famous workshop in the kingdom. Their names tied to the marvels of the age, their line raised higher by partnership than any marriage could have raised it. Tetsu got his granddaughter beside the royal mechanic. Iwa got his granddaughter beside the royal mechanic. They both won, which meant they both had to stop fighting, which was the one outcome neither had ever imagined, and the only one that could end a war that old. The two of them ended up grumbling companionably on the same bench, robbed of their feud, and I think in the end they were relieved to set it down. And then I built the last thing. The thing all of it had been leading toward, and it was the thing that mattered most, and the thing that cost the least, and the thing I was proudest of in 2 whole lives after a family put back together. A school, not a game of tablets for the headman's children. A real school in Ishibi for every child in the district, not just the ones with clever fathers or grandfathers with granddaughters to marry off, but every child, the poorest Paddy family's daughter and the migrant widow's son, and everyone, taught their letters and their numbers and their crafts. The same syllable tablets I'd carved at 4. Now teaching a whole district to read. Yuna and Kohana would run it with me, the first co-teachers. I would order it, as she ordered everything. And I built it for a reason I could finally say out loud. The reason under every reason. The thing I'd understood by the coals with Hinano and had known since a stone tower and a fish weir. I did not want to be a man everyone needed and no one loved. I did not want to be the one clever mind at the center of a district that would collapse without me. I'd lived that. I died of it, indispensable, useful, and alone in the snow. So I was doing the opposite, on purpose, as the last great work of my second life. I was giving the district my mind, spreading it out into every child who could read and count and think, so that Ishibi would never again need one clever boy at its center. So that if I fainted and didn't wake, if the wind won some night the way I'd always feared it might, the marvels would go on, because they wouldn't live in me anymore. They'd live in a whole district of literate, capable, thinking children. I was building myself out of the center, the exact opposite of the wall Koji built, a structure that could stand without its engineer under it, because I finally understood that a thing you build so it needs you forever is a thing you've built to be alone inside. Hinano, watching me lay out the school, understood it completely, because she understood me completely now. You're giving it all away, she said. The knowing, the thing that made you untouchable, you're just handing it to peasant children. I'm handing it to my district, I said. So it stops being mine and starts being ours. So nobody ever needs me the way. So nobody's ever alone in the middle of a thing they built. I looked at her. My sister, restored princess, bridged to a crown, sitting in a peasant school she'd chosen over a palace. You know what that's like? Being the peace everyone needs and nobody keeps. I'm making sure this whole district never learns that feeling. She didn't answer. She just reached over and took my hand. Princess and royal mechanic, 2 people the world had once thrown away, sitting in a schoolhouse they'd built. So this is what I'd made. By the autumn I turned 10. 4 years and a whole world from the newborn who couldn't hold up his own head. A father who was governor of the district, straight-backed and unafraid, trusted by a king. A mother at peace, her own parents by her fire. Her strange son known and held and never once again a stranger to her. A restored princess for a sister home by choice. The crown's own bridge, no leash on her anywhere. A first friend and a second, Yuna and Kohana. Rivals turned partners, turned the finest hands in the kingdom. Their grandfather's war ended in laughter. I, who'd learned her letters fastest. Now the manager of a district. Uncle Taku, the busiest craftsman for 100 miles, cursing gloriously over a workshop he loved. Renji, cousin to a king, sworn friend, guarding the border. Yutei, still masked, still cryptic, still holding the word blessed over me like a roof. A village grown into the richest, warmest, best defended, most literate district in the whole region. No famine, no fever gap, no child in the ground for 4 winters running. An army turned aside without a single death, and a school opening its doors to every child in it. I'd started as a lonely man dying in the snow, hard and useful and unloved, reaching for a number I never dialed. I'd become a boy at the center of a whole world that loved him. And the last thing, the thing I was still learning, the thing that was harder than any river or any king, was to simply let them love me, to stop earning it, to stop even now, even here, laundering my love through usefulness, through marvels, through things I built. Hinano had said it, and Renji had said it, and Sae knew it best of all. Everything I built so I could afford to be soft. But the building was almost done now. The district was safe, the knives were broken, the family was whole. And soon I could feel it coming. The way I'd once felt the fainting come, there would be nothing left to build, and nothing left to do but the one thing Koji Tanaka never learned. Just be there. Present. A son, a brother, a boy, home. There was a harvest festival coming. The whole district would gather. And I thought, laying out the last beam of the schoolhouse in the autumn light, that I would like for once to attend it, not as the royal mechanic with a plan, but just as Haru, just as a boy at his family's fire, to find out finally what that felt like.